Georgian became a regular. He was by, and most of the time we visited him together. I would entertain him up top and Ditlev would attend to things down below. We always got 100 marks for that. Sometimes one of us would go alone, too, for 60 marks. It goes without saying that Georgian was, on the one hand, a John like any other, not the best, but not that gross either. At the same time, he was the only customer for whom I felt something like friendship. I respected him. I liked talking to him. He was interesting and often had some real insights. He lived in the real world, and he lived well. I especially admired the way he handled money. That was the thing about him that interested me the most. He told me once about how, once he'd invested in something, the money almost seemed to grow by itself. He was incredibly generous. He didn't pay anyone else who attended his orgies, but once I was around when a younger guy asked him for a couple thousand marks, for a Mini Cooper. Georgian didn't get into a big discussion about it. Instead, he just wrote out a check and said, "Here." Georgian was the only customer who would sometimes have me over without asking for anything from me. I sometimes watched TV with him at night. Even I did. It seemed like all was right again with the world, at least while I was there. Meanwhile, it didn't take very long for Ditlev and me to settle right back into our old routine. We never went to the clubs anymore, they were for kids. So when I wasn't hanging around Zoo Station, I was at Kurfürstendamm. Sometimes there would be like 100 junkies just on the small subway platform there. That's where the dealing happened. There were a lot of Johns there looking to take advantage of some desperate junkie, but that didn't bother us. It was just the place where we met up. When I was there, I'd walk from group to group, talking with the others. I felt like I really mattered when I was making my rounds on that platform, right below the Kurfürstendamm. I felt like a star. I'd see the old ladies heading back from the department stores with their bags full of junk, staring at us with this disgusted, frightened look in their eyes, and I'd think, oh my God, we have it so much better than they do. Our lives might be hard, and it might not be the safest way to live, the prognosis wasn't good, anyway, but at the same time, we wouldn't have it any other way. For me at least, I liked it like that. I mean, think about the money I was making. Just for the heroin alone I needed 100 marks a day. With all the other expenses included, an average month cost about 4,000 marks. That's what I had to bring in, and it was a lot, but I still managed it. The way I looked at it was, I'm making more than a lot of my clients do, and I'm only 14 years old. Working the streets and turning tricks was pretty shitty work, obviously, but when I was on dope it didn't bother me that much. And anyway, I kind of ripped off my customers because they didn't get much for their money. I still called the shots. Sex was out of the question. But I was a pretty small player in the overall scene. I was in awe of the guys who said they needed 4 grams of dope every day. That worked out to 500 to 850 marks worth of heroin every day, but they almost always managed to get what they needed. So they were making more than almost anyone in Berlin at the time, and they were doing it without getting caught by the cops. And even if I wasn't at their level yet, I could still walk up to them at Kurfürstendamm, and they would talk to me. Anyway, that's what I was thinking at the time, back in February and March of 1977, when I was still okay. I didn't feel great, but still, I hadn't hit rock bottom yet. I still believed the lies I was telling myself. I'd slipped right back into the life of a junkie. I thought I was really cool. I wasn't afraid of anything. Before heroin, I was afraid of everything, of my father, and then later of my mom's boyfriend, of my shitty school and the teachers there, of landlords, traffic cops, and even subway ticket checkers. Now I felt untouchable. I wasn't even scared of the undercover cops who prowled around the station. And I had a reason to be cocky. At that point, I'd gotten through every police raid without so much as a scratch. Back then I was also hanging around with some other users, junkies, really, who I thought were somehow still in control. Ats and Lufo were like that. Ats was my first boyfriend. The only guy I'd had a close relationship with before Ditlev. I used to be crazy about him. In 1976, Lufo, like Ats and Ditlev, was part of our pot-smoking clique at the Sound. Ats and Lufo got stuck on dope right before I did. They got an apartment, and it looked like they'd made it. The apartment had a French bed, a matching couch and recliner set, and wall-to-wall carpeting. Lufo even had a totally legit, minimum wage job at Schwarzkopf. Both of them claimed that they'd never been physically addicted to heroin, and that they could go for weeks or even months without shooting up. I believed them, but at the same time, they were always high whenever I hung out with them. Ats and Lufo were my idols. At the time I was worried about sinking back to the state I was in before my first purge. I thought that if Ditlev and I could be as cool as Ats and Lufo were when it came to our habits, then we could also make it like they did and live in an apartment with a French bed, matching couch and recliner sets, and wall-to-wall carpeting. Also, neither of them was aggressive like the other junkies were, and Ats had a really cool girlfriend, too, Simone, who didn't shoot up at all. I thought it was awesome that they were so in love and accepting of each other, even though one of them was a user and the other one wasn't. I liked spending time at their place, and sometimes, when I'd had a fight with Ditlev, I slept on Lufo's couch. But one night I came home, and since I was in a good mood and felt like things were going pretty well overall, I stopped in the living room to sit down with my mom. Right away she got up and went to get the paper without saying a word. I could sense what was coming next. She always handed me the paper like that when there was a report about a heroin death. I hated it. I didn't want to read whatever she wanted to show me. But I read the obituary anyway. Glassblower's apprentice Andreas W., 17, wanted to get off drugs. His 16-year-old girlfriend, a nursing student, wanted to help him, but to no avail. The young man died of an overdose in an apartment in Tiergarten, which his father had furnished for the young couple for several thousand marks. The story didn't sink in right away, because I didn't want to believe it. But all of the elements were there: apartment, glassblower's apprentice, girlfriend, Andreas W. It was Andreas Wixoek, Ats. At first all I could think was, shit. My throat was dry and I felt like I was going to puke. I couldn't understand how Ats could have overdosed. Ats, of all people, who knew just how much dope he could handle and was always cool and in control. I didn't want to let my mom see how upset I was. She had no idea that I was using again. So I took the paper and just went back to my room. I hadn't seen Ats for a long time, but the paper filled me in on his last few days. According to the news story, he'd already been shooting up way too much during the previous week and had eventually landed in the hospital. His girlfriend, Simone, slashed her wrists right after that, but both of them survived. Then, the day before Ats died, he went to the police and ratted on all the dealers he knew, even these two girls who were known as the twins and who always had first-class heroin. Then he wrote a suicide note, which the paper reprinted in full. I'm ending my life because an addict only brings anger, anxiety, bitterness, and despair to his friends and family. He drags everyone else down with him. Please tell my parents and my grandmother that I'm thankful for all they did for me. I'm an absolute zero. To be a junkie means you're the worst of the worst, the bottom of the shit pile. Why do so many kids, so many young people who enter this world so full of life and hope fall into this kind of self-destructive cycle? I hope that my life can at least serve as a warning to someone else who may at some point ask himself the question, well, should I it, just this once? Don't be an idiot. Just look at me, and you'll have your answer. You don't have to worry about me anymore, Simone. Take care. I lay on my bed and thought, that was your first boyfriend, and now he's in a coffin. I couldn't even cry. I was totally numb. When I hit the scene the next afternoon, no one was thinking about us. It makes sense, nobody cries on the street. But on the other hand, some people were definitely pretty angry. ATS had ratted on some good dealers who sold first-class dope, and now they were all sitting in jail. Also, ATS still owed a lot of people a lot of cash. The craziest thing about this whole story is that a week after ATS died, his girlfriend, Simone, who'd never used before and who always tried to convince him to get off the stuff, started shooting up, too. A few weeks later, she quit her internship in the nursing program and started working the streets. Lufo died from an overdose about a year later, in January 1978. ATS's death completely obliterated this crazy fantasy that we all shared. We all used to believe that we could shoot up and still live normal lives. But now that dream was dead. Everyone in ATS's old crowd began to fear and mistrust each other. Before, when there weren't enough needles to go around, everybody wanted to be first. Now, all of a sudden, everybody wanted to go second. Nobody talked about how scared they were, but everyone was worried that the stuff would be too pure, too strong, or that it would be cut with strychnine or some other poison. You could die from an overdose, but you could also die from shit that was too pure or too dirty. So there it was. Everything was all fucked up again. It was just like ATS said in his suicide note. In the meantime, I was making life hell for my mom. I came home whenever I wanted, just like before, but whenever I got back my mom would still be up, no matter what time it was. It's funny, but the first thing she would do as soon as she knew I was back was take some Valium so that she could finally get some sleep herself. In fact, I think the Valium is the only reason she made it through that period. I was getting more and more freaked out by the thought that I was going to end up like ATS. But I'd find little things to cling to, still things that would give me some degree of hope for the future. Even at school. There was one teacher I really liked, Mr. Muck. In his class, we'd have to act out certain situations from a normal adult life. So we'd pretend to be going to a job interview, for instance. One of us would have to be the employer, and the other one would have to play the role of the applicant. When I played the job applicant, I wouldn't let the employer get a word in edgewise. Instead, I turned the tables on him, so that he felt intimidated and quickly backed down. I thought that maybe I could learn to assert myself like that in real life, too. We also went to the career services office with Mr. Muck. But that meant that we also had to watch an Allied Forces military parade. 31 The guys were all really into it. They couldn't shut up about the tanks and all the new technology. But I had the opposite reaction because the tanks made a hellish, head-splitting noise, and their only purpose was to kill people anyway. But then I got another boost in the career services office, when I read about the job of animal caretaker. I read through everything I could find about it, and the next day I went back with Ditlev and asked them to make me copies of everything they had on that kind of work. Ditlev, for his pan, found some information on a few jobs that he was really excited about. He was looking for something to do with animals or farming. We were so into it that we almost forgot that we still needed to get the cash for our next fix. So next thing you know, we're back at Zoo Station, waiting for customers, but still holding our bags full of photocopies from the Career Services Center. It made everything seem so unreal again. If I kept on going like this, I felt like I probably wouldn't even make it through high school. On my way to school the next morning, I bought a copy of Playboy at one of the subway stations. Ditlev loved Playboy, and I bought it for him as a present for him, although I always read through it first myself. I don't know why we both liked Playboy so much. Today, looking back, I just don't get it. But back then Playboy seemed like a cleaner world. Clean sex. Beautiful girls who lived problem-free lives. No perverts, no pedophiles, no clients at all. The guys in the magazines smoked pipes and drove sports cars and were rich. And the girls had sex with them because they wanted to, because it was fun. Ditlev said that that was all bullshit, but he still loved those magazines. While I was in the subway that morning, I read a short story from that issue. I didn't understand all of what it said because I was already pretty messed up from my morning hit. But I liked the mood of the story. It took place somewhere far away under a blue sky and a hot sun. I got to this spot where a pretty girl is waiting around for her boyfriend to get back home from work, and I just started to cry. I couldn't get a hold of myself and kept crying all the way to my stop, where I had to get out. When I was in school, all I could do was daydream about leaving with Ditlev, going someplace far, far away. And that afternoon, when I met Ditlev at the station, I told him about my daydream. At that point, he told me about his aunt and uncle in Canada. They lived on a huge lake with nothing but forests and cornfields around them, and he was sure they would take us in. He said I should finish school first, since that would be the smart thing to do. He would go ahead first and find himself a job. Apparently they had lots of jobs available, and when I followed after him a bit later, he would have already found a log cabin for us to live in together. I wanted to finish school first anyway. Things were already getting a lot better. I could feel it. I was determined not to talk back anymore. Instead, I would focus on my schoolwork and getting good grades. Ditlev went off with a customer, but I was still standing around and waiting. Suddenly there were these two guys behind me. "What are you doing here?" they asked me, and I knew right away they were cops. I'd never been arrested before, and the cops didn't scare me because up to now they'd always left me alone. I'd been turning tricks for a few months now at Zoo Station, along with a bunch of other girls my age. There were daily raids by the cops, but usually they were just looking for people who had smuggled cigarettes or schnapps over from East Berlin. So I stayed real and just told the cops I was waiting for my boyfriend. One of them asked me if I was working as a prostitute. "No way," I said. "Why? Do I look like one?" Then they asked me how old I was, and I said I was 14. They wanted to see my ID, but you can't even get an ID until you're 16. I made sure I explained that to them. One of them, apparently the leader, jumped in then and said, "Why don't you hand over that plastic bag there?" Right away he found the spoon. He asked what I used it for. I said, "I need something to eat my yogurt with, don't I?" But then he pulled out the toilet paper with the needles and everything, and at that point I had to go with them. They brought me to the police station near the zoo. I wasn't scared though. I knew that they couldn't throw a 14-year-old in jail. I was just pissed that these twashithied cops had ruined my day. They locked me in a cell right next to the chief asshole's desk. I was still so sure of myself, somehow, that I didn't even try to get rid of the dope that I still had in a little plastic bag in my jeans. I just couldn't get myself to do it, to throw away good heroin. But then a woman cop came in. I had to take off everything, even my underwear. She examined everywhere, every orifice, before she finally thought about checking my jeans pockets, where she found the drugs. One of the cops typed up the whole incident, all insanely complicated and tedious, on a sheet of paper, and when they were done they put a copy in a big fat binder. I was now on the record as a registered heroin user. But the cops were pretty nice about everything in the end, except for the fact that they kept coming back to me and asking, "God, sweetie, what the hell are you doing? You're only 14, you're young, you're pretty, but you're killing yourself with this stuff." I had to give them my mom's work phone number, and one of them went out of the room to give her a call. My mom got to the station after work, totally stressed out, around 5:30. She actually got into a conversation with these cops, who seemed like they were only capable of stupid jokes, and after they asked her the same thing they kept asking me, she said, I know, it's hard with these kids now. I don't know what to do with her anymore. I helped her quit once. But she actually doesn't want to quit. That was the last straw, doesn't want to quit. My mom didn't have the slightest clue about me or about heroin. Of course I wanted to stop. But how? That was what I'd like her to tell me. Once I was outside, she started to ask me all these questions. What had I been doing? Where had I been hanging out? And so on. Geez, Mom, I was just at the station. You know you shouldn't go there. I was waiting for Dittelf, but maybe I'm not allowed to do that anymore either. She thought I shouldn't be hanging out with that unemployed, antisocial loser anymore. Then she threw a question at me, are you selling yourself? And I screamed at her, are you crazy? I dare you to say that again. Why on earth would I ever sell myself? Can you explain that to me? So you think I'm a prostitute, huh? She backed down pretty quickly. But now I was really afraid I'd lose my freedom. And it was kind of scary, how cold my mom seemed to act toward him all of a sudden. It seemed like she'd given up on me now and would just let me fall on my own, wouldn't bother helping me anymore. But then I realized that she wasn't helping me anyway by just nagging about not going to that train station or hanging out with that loser Dittelf. I had to go home with my mom, and I didn't have any junk for the next morning either. When my mom got me out of bed the next morning, she looked at my face and said, "What son of eyes are those, sweetie? They're so blank. I see nothing but fear and despair in them." When she left for work, I looked in the mirror, and for the first time I saw what happened to my eyes when I went cold turkey. They were 100% pupil. Completely black and dull. Totally blank. I felt hot and washed my face. But then I was freezing, so I took a hot bath. I couldn't bear to get out of the tub because it was way too cold out there. I kept adding more and more hot water. Somehow I had to make it to noon. There was no way I'd find a customer at the Kurfürstendamm station or someone who'd give me a hit before then. Nobody had any junk until the afternoon. As things stood, it was pretty hard to find anyone who would share some with you. I could forget about asking Axel and Bernd, as they watched their stash like hawks. They needed every quarter-gram for themselves. They could barely make enough money to buy only that much. Even Dittelf was getting selfish with his supply. And the others on the street would have rather thrown their junk down the toilet than share it. As the withdrawal symptoms got worse, I forced myself to get out of the tub so that I could try to find some money in the apartment. The living room was locked, as always. Klaus, my mom's boyfriend, did that because he was worried that I would ruin his LPs. But I'd figured out how to pick the lock with a wire hanger. Unfortunately, the living room was broke, it didn't have a dime. But then I remembered the beer can on top of the kitchen cabinet. My mom used it as a container for all her shiny, 5-mark coins. My hands shook as I grabbed the heavy beer can, partly due to the fact that I was going into withdrawal, but also because I was about to steal from my mom, and I'd never sunk that low before. I wouldn't have even considered it. That's why I was different from the other junkies, from people like Bernd, who'd taken everything from his parents' apartment, piece by piece, the TV, the coffee maker, the electric bread slicer, anything that could be turned into cash for dope. I'd sold my jewelry and almost all my LPs, but at least that stuff was mine. So now I was dumping my mom's 5-mark coins out of the beer can. The street price of a quarter-gram had just gone down from 40 marks to 35. So I needed 7 of the 5-mark coins. I figured that since I usually charged my customers 40 marks, I'd get a $5 back in change. So I could easily replace one 5-mark piece every day. In a week I would have repaid the money, and my mom probably wouldn't even notice. So I took my 7/5s and went to my morning hookup spot outside the dining hall of the Technical University, picked up some heroin, and shot up in the university bathroom. I was already in full withdrawal at that point. My mom checked my NS for fresh needle marks every night, so I shot into my hand, always in the same spot. It turned into a scab, but I told my mom that it was just a scrape that wasn't healing well. Eventually she noticed that I had a fresh needle mark. "Give me a break," I told her when she found out. "What's the big deal? It was just today. I only do it once in a while, it's nothing to worry about." But nevertheless, she gave me a pretty good spanking. I didn't resist. It didn't really bother me much anymore. She treated me like a piece of shit anyway and was always yelling at me for something or other. Instinctively, she was doing exactly the right thing. An addict has to lose literally everything and feel like the last piece of shit on earth before she'll think seriously about changing something. Then she'll either kill herself, or she'll hang her hat on whatever slim chance she has to ditch the dope. But back then I didn't have that kind of insight yet. My mom still believed in me, though, and thought I could get better. She made plans for me to go and visit my grandma and cousins over spring break. She said that it was possible I could even stay longer. I didn't know if I should be happy or worried about the separation from Ditlev and the inevitable withdrawal symptoms I'd experience over there. But by now I was doing whatever anyone wanted anyway. I only insisted that Ditlev sleep over the last night before I left. During that last night in Berlin, I came up with yet another plan. After Ditlev and I had sex, I told him, "We've always done everything together. I really want to cut this shit out while I'm gone. I'll never get this kind of an opportunity again. You should do it, too. Then when I get back, we'll both be clean, and we can start a new life." Ditlev said that yeah, of course he wanted to quit with me. But that was no surprise. He already had a source for methadone. By the time I got back to Berlin, he'd have a new job, and starting tomorrow or the day after that he'd stop working the streets. The next morning I took a really big hit before I went off to grandmand my new life. When I arrived, the withdrawal symptoms hadn't started yet. But I felt like an alien in that idyllic farmhouse kitchen. Everything got on my nerves. It annoyed me that my little cousin wanted to get on my lap, even though I'd always loved playing with her when she was as a baby. The old outhouse, the one that I'd found so romantic last time, was also irritatingly outdated. The next morning, the withdrawal symptoms started up with a vengeance. I slipped out of the house and went into the woods, but the birds wouldn't stop their stupid twittering, and a little rabbit made me jump right out of my skin. I eventually climbed up into a tree stand. I couldn't even smoke. I wanted to die up there. At some point though, I don't know when, I crawled back to the house and got into bed. I told my grandma that I had the flu or something. She was a little concerned but not worried, despite the way things looked. Above my bed there was a poster that showed a skeleton hand holding a needle. Below the hand it said, "Curiosity was the beginning. This is the end." My cousin insisted that she got the poster in school. I didn't realize that my mom had already told my grandma that I was an addict. Now I was staring at the needle on the poster, only the needle though. I didn't pay any attention to the letters and the skeleton hand anymore. I just imagined that that needle held a 1/4 gram of first-class heroin. The needle seemed to peel away from the poster and float toward me. For hours I stared at that fucking poster and almost went insane. My cousin came into my room a lot and pretended not to notice what was going on with me. She kept playing these annoying cassette tapes of Tina Bopper music, probably thinking that they could distract me somehow. In retrospect, of course, it was touching how they were trying to help me and pretending not to know what was happening with me. That first day of withdrawal seemed like it would never end. Once, when I dozed off, I had a dream about this junkie I knew from the streets of Berlin. He was so messed up from shooting up that his skin had started to develop these open, oozing wounds all over. He was literally decomposing while he was still alive. His feet had already decayed and turned black. He could hardly walk anymore. He stank so badly, even from 2 yards away, that nobody could stand to be near him. But when anybody suggested that he should check into a hospital, he just grinned this deathly grin. He was just waiting to die. I couldn't get this guy out of my mind, that is, when I wasn't too busy staring at the needle in the poster or delirious from the pain. It was just like the first time, with all the same sweating and stinking and puking. The next morning I couldn't take it anymore. I dragged myself to the phone booth in town and called my mom. I was crying and blubbering snot into the receiver. I begged her to come and bring me back to Berlin. My mom was unfazed. She said coolly, "So you're sick again? I thought that you only used heroin sometimes." Well, in that case it can't be that bad. Finally I wound up begging her to send me some sleeping pills via express mail. I'd heard that in the next town over there was an active H scene. I figured that out during my last visit. But I didn't have the strength to get there. Also, I didn't know anyone over there. When a junkie is separated from his own scene, he's totally helpless and alone. Thankfully, the withdrawal period only lasted 4 days, just like before. Even it was over, I felt empty, depleted, sucked dry. It didn't even give me a sense of triumph to know that the poison was finally out of my body. I felt nothing but disgust for Berlin again, but I didn't belong in this town either. Actually, I felt like I didn't really belong anywhere. I tried to just not think about it. All I had for entertainment were the sleeping pills that my mom had sent, way too late, and a bunch of hard cider that was stored in my grandma's basement. I was starving though, and I ate everything. In the mornings I would stand with 4 or 5 rolls, and in the afternoons, in between meals, I'd eat like a dozen pieces of flatbread with jam. At night I'd go into the giant pantry and binge on the canned plums, peaches, and strawberries, with piles of whipped cream on top. I could never go to sleep before 2 or 3 in the morning anyway. In no time, I'd put on over 20 pounds. My butt got big, and I developed a serious potbelly. My relatives were delighted only my arms and legs stayed as skinny as they were before. But I didn't care. I couldn't stop eating. It was almost like I was addicted to food. It didn't take long before my skin-tight jeans didn't fit anymore. That's when my cousin gave me a pair of baggy pants like the kind I wore when I was 11. It didn't bother me though. I was becoming pan of the community here again, but I didn't think it was for real. That was a trip, a nice little movie, and it would all be over again soon. I kept drugs out of my conversations with other people, and I also did a pretty good job of keeping them out of my mind entirely. I didn't want to ruin this pretty little movie I was taking pan in. There was one exception though. Right after I arrived at my grandma's place, I wrote a letter to Ditlev asking him to send me some dope, for which I also included 20 marks. It showed just how hollow my earlier lectures about quitting were, but I couldn't help myself. I managed not to mail the letter, though, because I figured that Ditlev would just spend the money on himself anyway. I let my cousin show me around like I was a tourist and visited castles and other fortresses in the area, and I also went horseback riding almost every day. I went down into the quarry, which had once belonged to my grandpa, too, along with the other kids. My grandpa had literally sold the quarry and used the proceeds to fund his drinking habit. He drank himself to death eventually. That's the environment my mom grew up in. My grandma told me that somewhere in the quarry there was a room, locked up behind an iron door, that contained all the old family documents. And so we spent almost every night searching for that door. Sometimes the workers would forget to take the key out of the back hay. Then we would drive all over the quarry with that thing. I got along really well with my cousin who was the same age as me. I told her about how much I loved Dittelf, and she reacted as if it were a completely normal teenage romance. I also told her that we'd already slept together, and she didn't see anything wrong with that. She thought that was totally okay. My cousin said that there was a boy from Dusseldorf that she had a crush on. He always came up to where she lived on camping trips in the summer. He had wanted more from her, but she had stayed firm. She asked me if I thought that was dumb. I told her of course not. It was absolutely her decision, and if she didn't want that camper to touch her, then she shouldn't let him. She should wait until she found someone who she really wanted to do those things with. Everyone up there came to me for help with their problems. I turned into a regular Dear Abby for my cousin and her friends. I didn't mind though. I felt pretty comfortable doling out advice, especially when it came to adding some perspective to their trivial little issues and concerns. In fact, almost all their problems seemed ridiculously insignificant to me. But I always listened, and I always had some ready advice. There was nothing I was afraid to confront with these kids, but when it came to my own problems, I was helpless. Dittelf called me one night, and I was so excited and happy I could hardly stand it. He said that he was at a John's place, that's why he was able to call me. We talked for a really long time, thanks to this guy's generosity. I told Dittelf about my awful withdrawal experience and about how this time I'd almost gone insane. He said that he hadn't quit yet. It was just so sad. I was looking forward to seeing him again. I asked him if he could write me once more like he promised. Dittelf said that he really didn't feel like it. But he'd call me the next time he came back to this John's apartment. After our phone call, I felt reassured that I was as good as married to Dittelf. We belonged together, no matter what sort of shit he got himself into. At night, before falling asleep, I'd spend several silent minutes sending good thoughts to Dittelf. Praying almost. And I counted down the days until I'd be with him again. My grandma gave me a regular allowance, and I saved every penny. I wasn't sure why. Saving money had never been my thing. But once I'd saved up 40 marks, I couldn't deny what I was up to anymore. I was really proud of having saved so much and put it away in a safe place. 40 marks was the price of a shot. 40 marks was what I charged my customers. 40 was the magic number for me. Once I'd realized what I had in mind, I reprimanded myself for stockpiling drug money even while I was working to stay clean. And then, to drive the point home, I went into town and bought myself a t-shirt for 20 marks, just to get away from that damned number 40. I'd come to my grandma's house with the sole intention of getting clean. I never wanted to shoot up again. That was the whole point, to get away from that life for good. As the month came to an end, my mom called and wanted to know if I wanted to come back or stay a while longer. Without a second thought I told her I was ready to come back. Maybe if she had asked if I wanted to spend the rest of my life out there, I would have thought more about it. But since I knew that it was only a temporary state of affairs one way or the other, it just seemed like it had all been a kind of a dream, a nightmare at the beginning, but in the end a sweet, gentle, beautiful dream. But now it was over. After 4 weeks, it was time for me to get back to Dittelf. The first thing I did on the day that I was supposed to head back was to change back into my old set of clothes. My grandma and my cousin tried to convince me to stick with that old pair of checkered kids' pants, which at that point fit me perfectly again, but that was never a real possibility. Instead, I squeezed myself into my skinny jeans. The seams could hardly handle it, and there was no way in hell I could get the zipper up all the way. I slipped on my black men's blazer, and my favorite pair of high-heeled boots. So before I'd even left my grandma's house, I was already looking heroin chic. Or at least the best I could manage. I took the train back to Berlin with my pants undone. The next afternoon I went straight to Zoo Station. Ditlev and Bernd were both there. Axel, however, was not. I figured he was off with a customer. The two boys gave me a huge welcome. They were genuinely happy to see me. Especially Ditlev. I said, "So, you got a good job and dropped the dope." All three of us laughed. I asked, "How's Axel?" The boys looked at me kind of strange, and after a while Ditlev said, "Haven't you heard? Axel's dead." That knocked the wind out of me. I couldn't breathe for a while. "You're joking," I said between gasps. But I already knew that it was true. Axel. I'd spent most of my weekend nights with Ditlev over at Axel's place. He always put clean sheets out for me, even though the rest of the house was always a mess. He kept up a steady supply of yogurt for me, and I always brought him his beloved canned tuna. He was always willing to hear me out whenever I had any problems or whenever I had a fight with Ditlev. He was never angry or aggressive with anyone in our clique, and even though I was pretty guarded with everyone else, I could even cry in front of him. And now he was gone. XVHY? I asked. Ditlev said, they found him in some public toilet stall with a needle in his arm. For the two boys, Axel's death was already old news. But they seemed uncomfortable talking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about the goddamn tuna fish. Suddenly I realized that Ditlev might have also lost his place to sleep, so I asked him if he was still staying at Axel's place. "His mom has already sold the apartment," Ditlev answered. "I'm staying with one of my customers." "Oh, shit," I said. I just blurted it out because at that moment I thought that I'd lost Ditlev to one of his customers for good. The fact that Ditlev was living with a John hit me almost as hard as Axel's death. "The guy I'm staying with is pretty alright. He's still young, in his mid-20s, and he's still kind of in shape, too. I've already told him about you. You can sleep over there, too." We took the subway over to where we knew some dealers would be selling since Ditlev needed a hit. We kept running into people we knew, and whenever we did I would say to them, "Doesn't that just fucking suck about Axel?" But the others didn't react at all. So I just kept muttering the same thing over and over to myself. After scoring some dope, we went to the public bathrooms on Bülow Street. 32 Ditlev wanted to take care of business right away. I came along to help, but I was also hoping Ditlev would offer me some. I wanted to turn it down, just to show him that I was strong enough to do it. But I didn't get my chance because Ditlev never offered me any. The thing with Axel shocked me to the core, and I was having a problem processing it. When Ditlev was cooking up his dope, I suddenly got this insane craving. This is some serious shit with Axel and with Ditlev, I thought, and a shot will help you out, plus it's not like one little shot means anything. You don't become an addict again just like that. Ditlev said, "Are you serious? You want to get high? I thought you'd quit." "Course I did," I replied. "But that's not a big deal. It's easy to quit. After all, while I was away getting clean, you did the same thing, right? But whatever. I'm just freaking out a little bit after hearing what happened to Axel. I just want a little shot. Yeah, quitting's not a big deal. I could have done it, too, I just didn't feel like it. But I'm just saying, if you're clean now, you should stay clean and not stand up again now." While we were talking, and despite what he was saying, he finished shooting up himself and left a little bit for me, too. After being clean for so long, that little shot was enough to get me a little high. I almost forgot all about Axel. Almost. I went from sobriety to full-blown addiction way faster than I did the last time. My mom was clueless though. It took me a while to lose those extra pounds, and she was happy about how healthy I looked. If I wanted to see Ditlev now, then I had to head over to Rolf's house. That was Ditlev's client, the guy he was staying with. There was nowhere else we could go to sleep together anymore. I didn't like Rolf though. He was totally in love with Ditlev, and as a result he was really jealous of me. He loved it when we'd fight, and he always took Ditlev's side. That drove me crazy. Ditlev treated Rolf like his own personal servant, like a submissive wife or girlfriend. He sent him shopping and let him do all the cooking and cleaning. That pissed me off too, because I would have liked to do some of those things for Ditlev myself. So one afternoon I told Ditlev that it just wasn't working out. The three of us just didn't make a good team. It was like Rolf was the third wheel on the wagon. But Ditlev said he didn't have anywhere else to go. He said that Rolf was basically an okay guy, and it was nice to work for someone who wasn't a huge asshole. Ditlev did what he wanted with Rolf. And when he was angry or annoyed, he'd tell him bluntly, "Just be grateful that I stick with you." And Ditlev only slept with Rolf if he needed money really badly. Ditlev and I slept in a bed in the same room as Rolf. Even we had sex, Rolf would watch TV or just turn away from us. He was gay and didn't want to see us together. I guess all three of us were pretty fucked up. I couldn't shake the idea that Ditlev was going to become gay if he kept sleeping with men. There was one night in particular when I thought that it had finally happened. Ditlev needed money, so he had no choice, he had to sleep with Rolf. I lay in the other bed. Ditlev had turned off the light just like he always did when I was there, and he had to satisfy Rolf because he needed to earn some money. The whole thing seemed to take a really long time. And at one point I thought I heard Ditlev moaning. I up and lit a candle. Both of them were going at it under the blanket. It seemed like they were both touching each other. That was against the rules. Ditlev and I had an agreement, no one was allowed to touch us. So I was insanely pissed off. So pissed off that I wasn't even able to articulate what I actually wanted. I just said, "You guys seem like you're having a lot of fun over there." Ditlev didn't say anything, but Rolf was furious. He blew out my candle and kept Ditlev with him for the whole night. I cried silently into my pillow all night because I didn't want the other two to hear how much this affected me. The next morning, I was so upset that I honestly considered leaving Ditlev. The heroin was undermining our relationship at every turn, but we weren't even aware of it. We couldn't see what it was doing to us. It was clear to me now that as long as we were on edge, Ditlev would never be totally mine. I would have to share him with his customers, especially Rolf. In my case, of course, it was different. I sold myself at Zoo Station every day, and since I was under more serious time constraints, I didn't have the luxury of picking and choosing all my customers. At this point, there were a lot of times when it was the clients, and not me, who set the terms of our agreement. In order to keep away from Rolf, I started to spend more time again with the other people in our clique, especially with Babsi and Stella. But it was getting to be more difficult to get along with them as well. Everyone wanted to just talk for hours about themselves, nobody cared what was going on with anybody else. Babsi, for example, was going on and on about the weird punctuation on traffic signs, while Stella and I wanted to talk about how a dealer ripped us off. He gave us flour instead of dope. We told Babsi to shut up, but after Stella and I had gotten control of the conversation, we wound up fighting with each other over who would get to tell the rest of the story. Most of our conversations ended with someone yelling, "Shut up." We were all desperately in need of someone who could listen to us. But that person just didn't exist, at least not in our circle of friends. There was no real communication amongst us anymore. The only time anyone paid any attention was when we were talking about the cops. We were all united in our opinion against the fucking cops. I was actually a bit more developed than the others in that respect, because in the early summer of 1977 1D already been arrested for the third time. It happened at Zoo Station. Ditlev and I were just coming back after an encounter with a customer. He'd given us 150 marks just to watch us. So we were pretty happy, each of us with a quarter of dope in our pocket and plenty of cash left over. I saw them first, the cops underscoring onto the platform. It was a drug raid. A train was just pulling in, and I was running down the platform in total panic. Ditlev, not thinking clearly at that moment, ran after me. As I jumped onto the last car of the train, I ran right into an old man. He said, "Fucking zombie hag. Watch where you're going." He really said that. Thanks to the newspaper coverage, almost everyone seemed to know what was going on at Zoo Station. So even the drones in the subway realized quickly that this was a drug raid in progress. Ditlev was right behind me, and behind him, of course, were two undercover cops. After all, we'd behaved suspiciously enough. The cops didn't have to work very hard to catch up with us, despite our head start. Even before they'd arrived on the scene, a bunch of geriatrics in the subway had grabbed hold of us, gripping our clothes and screaming hysterically, "Here they are! Police! Police!" I felt like an outlaw in an old western, and it seemed like the next scene was going to show Ditlev and me dangling from some tree. I clung tight to Ditlev, but when the cops took us away, one of them just said, "That Romeo and Juliet act isn't going to cut it, so hurry it up, let's go." We were loaded into a Viet bus and taken to the police station. The cops were mean, but they didn't bother taking down any additional information on me. They just told me that since this was the third time that they'd picked me up, they already had a binder on me. One of them typed up the usual statement, and all I had to do was sign it. They didn't even take the time to notify my mom. In their eyes, I was just another hopeless case. They'd keep filing away these statements and filling up the binder until the day when they could finally put a cross next to my name and forget about me. Ditlev and I were released about an hour later. Since they'd confiscated our dope, we had to go straight back to the hot zone to score 2 more quarters. Luckily for us, we still had some cash. The undercover cops all knew me by then, and they generally left me alone. One of them, a young guy, with a cute, friendly Bavarian accent, was even kind of nice to me. The first time he saw me, he snuck up behind me and shoved his badge in my face. I was obviously freaked out and worried, but then he laughed and asked me if I was working the streets. I answered innocently, like I always did, "The streets? Me? Are you serious?" But he wasn't buying it. Still, he didn't even bother to go through my bag. He just told me to stay out of the area for a few days so that he wouldn't have to take me into the station. I bet the other officers at his station must have appreciated that, too, since taking me in would require that they write up yet another statement about a zombified 14-year-old addict. After getting arrested, we couldn't find our old dealer, so Ditlev and I had to buy our dope from this new guy whom we'd never heard of before. Then we went to the public bathrooms at Winterfeldplatz 33 to shoot up. The doors on all the toilet stalls had been broken off, and the sinks were all broken and dry. I cleaned my syringe with the water from the toilet, which was in a pretty bad way. It was gross, but I used that tactic from time to time because a lot of the bathrooms were too busy for us to risk cleaning the syringe in plain view by the sink. I don't know what was in it, but the new dope from the new dealer totally knocked me out. I fell flat on my face right outside the bathrooms. And even though I picked myself up right after that, I was still really groggy. For the first time in a long time, we decided to go to the Sound. Ditlev was looking for a party, so he went straight to the dance floor while I positioned myself, strategically, next to this unattended tank of orange juice. It had a hole at the top, so I leaned against the vending machine, pushed 2 straws together, stuck them into the top, and drank my fill. Without paying a cent, I was able to drink until I had to go to the bathroom to throw up. When I got back, one of the managers got up in my face. He called me a junkie whore and told me to come with him. He grabbed me by the arm and dragged me across the room. He opened a door that led to the storage area where they stacked the beverage crates. I also noticed that there was just one bar stool inside. Now I was scared. I knew immediately what was going on. Or at least I thought I did, since I'd heard so much about this room. In here, the management would make the junkies, along with anyone else they happened to despise, strip down to nothing, and then tie them up to the bar stool. After the person was rendered totally helpless, they'd beat him up with whips and whatever else was on hand. I'd heard about guys who'd ended up in the hospital with cracked skulls or other broken bones after just one session in the sound storage room. They were so traumatized and intimidated that they couldn't even go to the police afterward. I'm sure the management at the Sound justified what they did by saying that it helped to keep junkies and drug addicts away, which in turn kept the authorities from being able to shut the club down, but clearly they also did it because they were natural sadists, and they just wanted to. There was one thing that the girl junkies could do to save themselves a beating, though, because if you agreed to have sex with the manager then he would leave you alone. The Sound was just an absolutely brutal environment. If parents knew what really went on at Europe's hottest club they would never have let their kids go there. Every day more kids started using heroin in and around the club, and every day another young girl was reeled in by one of the pimps or hustlers who lurked around the place, and still the management did nothing. They just didn't care. So there I was, standing at the door to the storage space and just absolutely consumed with panic and fear. With a strength that was surprising even to me, I ripped myself away from that guy and ran like crazy for the exit. I made it all the way to the street before he caught up with me. He grabbed onto me, but instead of dragging me back down he just threw me, hard, like a piece of trash, against a nearby car. I didn't even feel the impact though. I was more worried about Ditlev at that point. They knew that we were always together. And after he'd run over to the dance floor, high as a kite, I hadn't seen him again. I ran over to a phone booth and called the police. I told the cops that my boyfriend was being assaulted at the Sound. They seemed thrilled to hear it, and it only took them a couple of minutes to show up, a whole van load of them. They were clearly hoping to be able to finally shut the club down. But after the dozen or so cops that were there had finished combing the place for Ditlev, there was still no sign of him. That's when it occurred to me to call Rolf. Ditlev was already there, in bed. After all the drama, one of the cops came over and said, "So, you were just high, right? Listen, don't you ever pull anything like this again." As I made my way home, I couldn't help thinking that all the heroin was making me lose my grip on reality. Because I'd been arrested and taken into custody so many times, I was eventually summoned to pay a visit at the police department's criminal division. My appointment was for 3 p.m. at a building on Gautier Street, room 314. I'll always remember that room number because it was about to become the destination of many future visits as well. After school I went straight home to shoot up. I gave myself a healthy dose because I thought that if I was high enough, the cops wouldn't be able to rattle me. But it so happened that I was out of lemon, and that was a problem because the dope I had was far from pure. It was hard to get good stuff. Every time the dope changed hands, going from a big dealer to a middleman to a smaller dealer down the line, it was being cut with something else in order to increase the profit. So I had to find a way to dissolve this dope that had already been cut with so much else. I decided to use vinegar because, like lemons, it also has a fair amount of acid in it. I poured the vinegar onto the spoon with the dope, but I poured too much. So with that done, I had to shoot this vinegar solution into my vein along with the dope. It was either that, or I'd have to throw everything out, and that wasn't going to happen. As soon as I'd shot up, I was out cold. It took more than an hour for me to regain consciousness. When I did, I could see that the syringe was still stuck in my arm. My head felt like it was going to explode, and at first I couldn't even stand up. I thought that maybe this was it. That I was finally going to die. I just lay on the floor and cried. I was so afraid. I didn't want to die, especially not like this, all alone. So I made my way over to the phone on my hands and knees. It must have taken me about 10 minutes to dial my mom's office number. When I finally did, all I could do was mumble, "Please. Please, Mom. Come home. I'm dying." Once my mom got back, I was able to stand up again. I pulled myself together, even though my head still felt like it was going to burst. I told her I had another stupid circulatory collapse. My mom obviously knew that I'd started using again. She had a desperate look on her face but didn't say anything to me about it. She just kept staring at me, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. I couldn't take it. The knock on her face pierced me right through and made my head pound even worse than before. After a while, my mom asked if there was anything I wanted. Yes, I said. Strawberries. So she went out and got me a big basket full of strawberries. In the course of that afternoon, I got the feeling that I was running out of time. I hadn't shot up a huge amount, it was just too much vinegar. Even something went wrong, my body didn't have any ability to resist or fight back anymore. I couldn't keep treating it this way. I couldn't keep abusing it. I could recognize my downward spiral for what it was because of the fact that I'd already seen it happen before with some of my friends who had already died. The first warning sign was when they started to just pass out after shooting up. It kept going on that way, with things getting worse and worse, and then eventually there would be one time when they passed out and just never woke up again. That was it. Game over. I was afraid to die. But if you had asked me at the time for a reason why, I wouldn't have been able to offer any good reasons. I just didn't want to be alone when it happened. Junkies tend to die alone, and to add insult to injury, the setting for the big event is usually a stinking toilet stall. But all that aside, I had more or less made my peace with death. I mean, after all, what was I waiting for at that point? I couldn't think of any reason why I ought to stick around. Even when I was younger, it was hard to think of any real reason for me to be here. And now that I was a heroin addict, it wasn't like things were getting any better. That was the point. The longer I stuck around, the more lives I would probably ruin, including my own. If I died, I would be doing my mom a favor. Sometimes I myself had trouble telling whether I was alive or already gone. The next morning I was feeling better, though now at least I had some hope that I could go on for a little longer. But I had to make it to the police, unless I wanted them to come and get me. There was just no way I could handle going by myself now. No way. I called around looking for Stella and was lucky to get a hold of her at this client's place. He was a customer we shared. I asked if she'd come to the police station with me. She was game to go right away. Her mom had just reported her as missing again, but Stella wasn't afraid of anything, she couldn't care less. She wanted to go with me to the precinct, even though she was officially a missing person at the time. So Stella and I went and sat like a couple of good girls in the long hallway outside of room 314, waiting for my turn with the police. When my name was called, I walked into the room so meek and obedient that if anyone had asked, I would have even curtsied. Mrs. Schipk, an overly friendly woman, took my hand, held it warmly, and told me right away that she also had a daughter like me, even though she was a year older than me and not using drugs. She acted really maternal with me. She asked how I was doing, and like a good aunt she even brought out some chocolate milk, cake, and apples. This Mrs. Chip sounded like she cared about some of the people I knew from the drug scene, asking where they were now and how they were doing. She showed me some photos of junkies and dealers and asked if I knew them. Yes, I kept telling her, sure, I recognize him, I've seen him once or twice. Then she told me that a number of these people had said this or that thing about me, and eventually, after enough of that kind of stuff, she got me to talk. I realized that she was setting me up, and not even doing it very delicately, but I still wound up giving her a lot of information. Afterward I signed a statement, swearing the truth to a whole bunch of shit that she'd been feeding me. While we were wrapping up, another cop happened to ask me about the sound more generally. That's when I decided to really open up. I told him about all the people I knew who had been seduced into the H scene there and about the brutal tactics that the management used over there. I also let them bring in Stella, who corroborated everything and said she would swear to it all in court. Mrs. Chip kept leafing through her files and quickly figured out who Stella really was. She started to grill her, and Stella immediately returned fire and shut Chip down. Stella was so insulting that I thought that they'd book her right on the spot. But Mrs. Chip's shift was over and done with, and she wanted to go home, so she just told Stella to come back the next day. Stella, of course, had no intention of obeying any of this woman's orders or requests. As she was leaving, Mrs. Chip said to me, "Well, I'm sure you and I will see each other again soon." The tone she used was exactly the same as it had been the whole way, too fucking sweet and friendly. That was what really stung. Despite her smiles, it was clear that she thought I was a totally lost cause. There was no hope for me. Gerhard Alber, chief detective and head of the narcotics division in the Berlin Police Department's drug squad, in our fight against drug abuse, the police department believes that by making every effort to restrict the supply of drugs, especially heroin, in and around Berlin, we provide an essential support to the efforts of other state agencies in offering therapy and rehabilitation to drug users and addicts. In 1976 we impounded 6.4 pounds of heroin, in 1977 it was 10.8 pounds, and in the first 8 months of 1978 we've already impounded 18.5 pounds of heroin. This increase in seizures doesn't necessarily mean, however, that we're keeping up with the increased amount of drug availability and consumption in the area. In that respect, I am personally rather pessimistic. The quantities of heroin in circulation have definitely increased. Just 1 year ago, the arrest of a German middleman with a quarter-pound of heroin would have been a small sensation. Today it's a pretty regular occurrence. The success of our investigations have caused the smugglers and dealers to become more cautious, as was to be expected, and we, in turn, have become even more vigilant. But the more visibly we penetrate the areas where drug addicts and small dealers tend to gather and do business, the deeper into the underworld they go, and the harder they are to find and track whatever we as a police department accomplish, and whatever means we try. Whether we use quiet surveillance and undercover cops or conduct obvious patrols and raids, the drug market will always find a way to endure. More and more often, heroin is being sold in private homes, where addicts can evade the eye of the police. To give just one example, 24 of the 84 people who died of heroin overdoses in Berlin in 1977 were not known to us as users of the drug, and these people most certainly didn't die after just one shot. Even the most persistent drug user often doesn't come to the attention of the police until he gets admitted to a hospital, usually while unconscious. Otherwise, a person can abuse heroin for years without coming to our attention. To put it bluntly, the police department can't solve the drug problem by itself. As the United States discovered during Prohibition, wherever there's an intense demand, the suppliers will find a way to meet it. I could, of course, hire another 20 officers and arrest more of the small-time dealers, but the problem would then just shift over to the prison system, where heroin already has a strong presence. Imprisoned addicts are willing to do anything to get their hands on some dope, and imprisoned dealers will do almost anything to supply them. Everyone is corrupted in situations where the profit margins are as high as they are with heroin right now. Heroin addicts don't care about anything but their next score. Preventative education is the only thing, in my opinion, that has any chance to stop heroin's rise in our community. Renate Schipk, administrator in the drug addiction department. I first met Christiane while working as an administrator in the drug addiction department. She had been summoned to respond to a normal police filing and came to see me with her girlfriend Stella. This was the first of 6 or 7 visits we would have together. At the time, I was spending most of my time interrogating addicts who had come to the attention of local police, with the idea that they might give up the names of some of their dealers. The police file an incredible number of reports, and that leaves me with more interviews to do than I really have time for. As a rule, there's not much time to spend thinking about the problem as a whole. But I still try to get to know the people who are summoned, and I try to establish some sort of relationship with them because otherwise it's just not possible to conduct a successful interrogation. When we first started to talk, Christiane was quite open and very willing to supply the information I was looking for. I was struck by her humility. She gave the impression of being a child who was raised the right way. During the first interrogation, she still seemed like a little girl in many ways. She always spoke well of her mother, and I have to say that her mother was very concerned about her compared to many of the other parents I see. I spent a lot of time on the phone with her. After a few more interviews, Christiane began to act much more insolent and rude. It was hard to believe she was only 14. I gave it to her straight and told her that addiction was a one-way street, even if she was able to get clean occasionally. We had a few blowout fights on that score alone. But I don't want to say anything negative about Christiane. She wasn't one to carry a grudge. But it's simply impossible to help these addicts. They always feel tricked and wrongfully accused, as they don't understand why they should be punished. In my opinion, these young people are just plain foolish and much too reckless. They start using heroin out of boredom and curiosity and then are surprised when faced with the consequences. I hope that for her own sake, Christiane gets the most severe sentence possible, as I believe that the shock of being in prison could motivate her to want to become sober. At least that's my hope. In the subway one was so angry it was hard for me to keep it together. I couldn't believe I had let that policewoman wrap me around her little finger like that with just some hot chocolate, cake, and her revolting, fake friendliness. After I serviced 2 clients at Zoo Station and scored some more dope at Kurfürstendamm, I went home. My cat was lying in the kitchen and could hardly get up. He'd been sick for a few days. Now he looked so emaciated and meowed so pitifully that I thought he would die soon, too. I was more anxious about my kitty than I was about myself. The vet gave me some medicine for him. But the cat wasn't eating anything. He lay in front of his small bowl and didn't even lift his head. I was planning on shooting up, so I took out my needle, but then I had an idea. I drew some of the medicine into the syringe and used it to squirt a little into his mouth. He was so worn out that he didn't resist. After that, it took me a long time to clean out the needle again, prepare everything, and finally get my fix. Heroin didn't give me the kind of high that it used to anymore. My fear of death ruined everything. I didn't want to live anymore, but at the same time I became incredibly anxious when I shot up, about the next shot being my last. Maybe it was also true that my cat's illness underlined how really sad and dark death is, especially if you haven't really lived yet. I felt completely hopeless. I hadn't had a single meaningful conversation with my mom since she discovered that I was shooting up again. I screamed and fought about every little thing, and she just kept giving me that sad, dejected look of hers. The police were after me for real now. The statement that I'd signed at Schipk's office was enough for them to put me on trial and enforce a juvenile court sentence. I also got the feeling that my mom would be been glad to relinquish some of her responsibility for me. After all, she must have realized by that point that there was nothing she could really do for me. She was always on the phone with drug rehab counseling centers and other government agencies, and at the same time she just kept sliding deeper and deeper into despair. It didn't take long for her to get the picture. Nobody thought they could help me, and nobody wanted to anyway. At that point, she decided that the only other thing she could do was probably just send me off to her relatives, so that's what she threatened to do. Sometime in May of 1977, even I, with what was left of my drug-addled brain, that I had two options left: either I gave myself the golden shot, a fatal overdose, as soon as possible, or else I had to make a serious attempt to get off of heroin for good. I knew that I was all alone in making that decision. I couldn't even count on Ditlev. But even more important was the fact that, whatever I decided, it had to be my decision, and not Ditlev's. I went to the center house back at Gropiusstadt, back to the youth center where my drug career had gotten started. It turned out that the whole place had been shut down since by that time the drug problem in the area was totally out of control. In its place they now had a drug counseling center. Seriously, a real drug counseling center, just for Gropiusstadt. That's how many heroin addicts were there now, only 2 years after heroin first cropped up in that area. When I went in, they told me exactly what I was expecting to hear, that the only way I would ever get clean was by going into genuine, serious therapy. They gave me the addresses for the 2 rehab clinics that had had the most success in dealing with addicts. I was pretty apprehensive about these kinds of therapy programs because the word on the street was that they were really pretty brutal. That's what I'd heard anyway. Some people said they were even worse than jail. In one of these clinics, they even shaved you bald first. I guess that was supposed to be a demonstration of the fact that you were ready to begin a new chapter of your life. I didn't think I could let them shave off all my hair. I didn't want to be turned into some cut-rate Kohack. 34 to me, my hair was, in a way, the thing that was more me than anything else. It protected me. I could even hide behind it. And so I thought, if they cut off my hair, I might as well just kill myself. But then the drug counselor said that I wasn't very likely to actually get admitted to either of these 2 programs because they didn't have any open spots right then. The admissions requirements were incredibly tough, she told me. You had to still be in pretty good physical shape and be able to prove to them that you still had the willpower to get off of heroin. The drug counselor said that since I was still so young, not even 15, that it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for me to meet their demands. And for kids, there really wasn't any drug therapy available yet. I said that I actually wanted to go to Narcotics Abusers Anonymous anyway. Narcotics Abusers Anonymous, also known as Narcanon, was the rehab center for the Church of Scientology. There were a few addicts I'd run into who had already spent some time at Narcotics Abusers Anonymous, and they all said that it was actually not that bad. They didn't have any admissions requirements at all so long as you paid in advance. They let patients wear their own clothes, bring their own music, and even keep their own pets. The drug counselor responded by saying that I should think more carefully about the organization. She asked me why I thought so many junkies said the program at Narcanon was so great. Was it because it worked or because they could enjoy themselves for a while and then keep shooting up when it was over? She said she couldn't call to mind a single case where Narcanon had helped a person really get clean. I asked her if she could think of any other place where I could go if I didn't stand a chance of getting in at the other places we'd talked about. At that point, she gave in and passed me the address for Narcotics Abusers Anonymous. When I got home, I used that same trick again and dribbled some more of that medicine into my cat's mouth with my old syringe. When my mom came home, I told her that I was going to get clean for good at Narcanon. I'll have to stay there for a few months, I told her, or even a year, and then that will be it. I'll be sober. My mom acted as if she didn't believe a word I said. But still, she went straight to the phone and tried to find out more about the new program. I was totally into this rehab trip. I felt like I had a chance to start fresh, to start a whole new life. I decided not to see any clients that afternoon, and I stayed away from dope, too. I wanted to get sober before even showing up. I didn't want to have to stand out in the cold turkey room. I wanted to arrive totally clean and get a headstand on the others. I wanted to prove right off the bat that I had ability to quit. I went to bed early and laid the cat, who was sicker than ever now, on the pillow beside me. I was proud of myself. I was withdrawing all by myself, all alone, and it was all my own decision. How many heroin addicts could do that? When I told my mom that I'd stop using right away, all she did was respond with a dubious smile. She didn't even take any time off from work to help me. All these withdrawal sessions seemed hopeless to her now, and she couldn't muster much excitement for them. So yeah, I had to get through it all by myself. The next morning I felt the full brunt of the challenge I was up against. It was just as bad as ever, the withdrawal symptoms, and maybe even worse, but at no point did I lose my self-belief. When I felt like the pain was going to kill me, I just told myself, that just means you're getting the poison out. You'll survive, and when you're done that will be it. Once the poison's gone, it will never come back. You won't let it. The one good thing was that when I passed out, I didn't have any nightmares or start tripping in that old kind of horror landscape. Instead I had these beautiful glimpses of my life after the rehab. Even the pain let up after 3 days, my imagination went wild, and I started creating these idealized scenes in my mind. As I settled into these visions, they seemed almost real. In one of these fantasy worlds, I had stayed in school and even taken the university entrance exams. I had my own apartment, and a VVV cabriolet was parked in the driveway. When I took it out, I drove with the top down. The apartment was on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by lots of trees. Maybe it was in Rudau, or maybe in Grunewald. My place was located in an old but still elegant building. It wasn't decadent though. It wasn't like all those gaudy old apartment buildings near the Kurfürstendamm, the ones with high ceilings, decorative stucco, huge entrance halls, marble floors, red carpet runners in the hall and up the stairs, the ones with mirrors everywhere and the tenants' names printed in gold leaf on their doors. My place wasn't like that at all. It wasn't poisoned with the stench of money and power. It was already clear to me that wealth on that scale came from a life spent lying and stealing, a high-stress life spent running back and forth on a high wire. That wasn't for me. I wanted something simpler, an apartment in an old working-class neighborhood with 2 or 3 small rooms, low ceilings, small windows, and time-worn steps in the stairwell. I wanted a place where it always smelled a little of someone else's home cooking and where the neighbors would poke their heads out of their doors and say, "Hey there, Christiane. How are you?" The stairs would be so narrow that you'd inevitably brush up against your neighbors when you went up and down. Everyone in the house would work hard, but everyone would be content with what they had. They wouldn't need money or goods for their own sake, and they wouldn't be jealous. They'd help each other out. The people I would live with, like the people who I saw in my daydream, would be as different from the money-hungry elite as they would be from my dingy old neighbors at Gropiusstadt. In the house that I imagined, it was calm and peaceful. The most important place in my dream apartment was the bedroom. Against the right-hand wall stood a very wide sleeper sofa covered in dark fabric. On either side of it was a night table. One was for Dittelf, for when he stayed with me. And then there stood a potted palm on each side of the sofa. The room was full of plants and flowers. The wall behind the bed was covered in wallpaper better than what you got in stores though. This wallpaper depicted a desert scene with enormous sand dunes, some palm trees in the distance, and, at a nearby oasis, some Bedouins with white turbans sitting in a circle, drinking tea. They looked very relaxed. A scene of total peace on the left side of the bedroom, in the alcove where the dormer window was built into the roof, was my sitting corner. It was a sitting area like they have in India or in the Middle East. There were a bunch of pillows gathered around a low, round table. That's where I sat at night, peacefulness personified, unworried, unbothered, and lacking for nothing. The living room in this fantasy was just like the bedroom. The same plants, the same carpets. But in the middle was a large, round, wooden table with wicker chairs. When my friends came over, we would all sit around that table eating what I'd cooked and drinking tea. Books covered the shelves that had been built into the walls. They were all classic books, written by people who, like me, had found inner peace and who enjoyed nature and animals. I'd made the shelves myself out of boards and thick ropes. Most of the things in my apartment I'd made myself because I didn't like whatever was for sale in the furniture stores. The furniture in the stores looked pretentious and was just a way for people to display their wealth. There were no DCHRS in my apartment, only curtains, because I didn't want my guests to have to endure the sound and stress of doors opening and closing all the time. I had a dog, a Rottweiler, and 2 cats. I'd taken out the back seats of my cabriolet so that the dog would have more space and feel more at ease when I drove around with him. In the evenings, I'd take my time cooking dinner. I wanted to feel peaceful while cooking and not rush around all stressed out, the way my mom did. Then a key would turn in the front door. It was Ditlev coming home from work. The dog jumped up on him, and the cats arched their backs and rubbed against his legs. Then Ditlev gave me a kiss and sat down at the dinner table. That was what I saw when I looked inside myself and dreamed. Except I didn't realize that it even was a dream. For me, it was just what was going to happen the day after tomorrow. That's how things would be after rehab. My whole world would change. I was so sure about this total transformation that I even told my mom after my 3rd day of withdrawal that I'd be moving out when I finished with the program. I was going to get my own apartment. On the 4th day, I was feeling so good already that I was able to get up and walk around again. I still had 20 marks in my pocket, and my awareness of the extra cash kind of set me on edge because right there, I was already halfway to 40, and with 40 I could buy myself one last and final fix before I went to Narconon the next day. I started talking to my sick kitty. I told him that I was going to be gone for a couple hours but that he didn't need to worry. With my syringe, I gave him a little chamomile tea with sugar, the only thing he could still keep down. Then, before I left, I promised him that he was going to make it just like me. Since I felt so good about things right then, I wanted to go for one last walk along the Kurfürstendamm. I knew that once you were at Narconon, there was no going out, or at least no going out alone. But since I was going to be over there, I'd have to shoot up at least a little bit because otherwise that whole area was just way too depressing. I only needed to get another 20 marks, and if I could find even one customer, that would be easy. But I didn't want to run into Ditlev over there and have to tell him, hey, I just went through withdrawal, all by myself, and I feel really good about it. But now I need to find a John, I need to make a 20. There was no way Ditlev would have understood. He would have laughed and told me I was never going to change. Once a junkie, always a junkie. I didn't want to go through that, not under any circumstances. But then, while I was in the subway, I had an idea. I'd head over to the boulevard. The reason why it first sprang to mind was because of the amount, 20 marks. For a job on the boulevard, the usual payout just happened to be exactly 20 marks. Babsi and Stella already worked the boulevard at the corner of Kurfürstenstrasse and Genfiner streets, but I was still really freaked out by it. I didn't like that the customers couldn't walk up to you, like at Zoo Station, which gave you some time to check them out. Instead, You had to just walk over to the customer's car when he waved. So you could never tell what kind of guy he was going to be. The worst thing was when you fell into the hands of a pimp. The pimps pretended to be customers, but once they got you into their car, there was nothing you could do. Most pimps didn't really want junkies working for them because too much of the earnings went toward dope. But they did want to drive the junkies away from the area because junkies got in the way of the professionals' business. Babsy once got into a pimp's car by accident. He kept her locked up for 3 days. He tortured and then raped her. He gave access to anyone and everyone, hobos, drunks, criminals, he didn't care. And of course Babsy had to deal with suffering through withdrawal at the same time. Something snapped in her around that time. But she still went back to work the streets. After all, she was the little queen with the angel face. The professional hookers were almost as dangerous as the pimps. The corner at Potsdamer Street was where all the nastiest, meanest, most time-tested prostitutes in Berlin all worked, and it was only a couple football fields distance away from where the baby prostitutes hung out on the Kurfürstenstrasse. Sometimes they'd organize their own kind of raids on the girls, and if they caught one, they'd scratch her face to shreds. I got out at the Kurfürstenstrasse subway stop and was immediately petrified with fear. In my head I went over the advice that I'd always heard Stella and Babsy give about the boulevard: stay away from younger guys in big American cars, they are most likely pimps. The ones to focus on are the older guys, the ones with a gut, a tie, and, better yet, a hat, they are okay. And best of all were the men who had a baby seat in the back. Obedient family men who just wanted a little variety, a little time away from mommy, and who were guaranteed to even more frightened than the girls. I walked the 100 yards or so from the subway station to Genfiner Street, over by where the sound used to. I pretended that I just happened to be passing by. I didn't walk close to the street, instead I veered over toward the house, but somebody still stopped right away. But he looked kind of weird to me. Maybe it was the beard, but for whatever reason I suspected that he was a kind of aggressive guy. So I gave him the finger and kept on walking. There was no one else in sight. After all, it was still before noon. From Stella's and Babsy's stories I knew that the customers got anxious when they'd taken a half-hour off for this and there were no girls to be had. Sometimes there were more customers than there were girls. So before long, a couple more cars stopped, but I still pretended not to see them. I looked into the shop window of a furniture store and was immediately transported back to that vision I'd had of my future life. I had to remind myself to get a grip, to pull myself together. All I wanted to do was just get this over with as quickly as possible, earn my 20 marks, and go. It took concentration. You had to focus on the task at hand or else it was going to take too long. A white car pulled over next to me. There wasn't a child seat in the back, but the guy didn't look very dangerous. I got in without thinking a second thought, and we agreed on a fee of 35 marks. We drove to Oskanischka Place. There was an old, abandoned train station there that belonged to the DDR's National Railway. The whole thing didn't take long. The guy was nice, and right away I had that wonderful feeling again. I even forgot that he was a customer. He said that he'd like to see me again, but that it couldn't be anytime soon since he and his wife and kids were going on a vacation to Norway in a few days. I asked him if he would do me a favor and drive me to Hardenberg Street, to the technical university over there, and he said it would be no problem. There was a big drug scene over by the university in the mornings. It was a beautiful warm day, the 16th of May, 1977. I remember the date well because it was 2 days before my 15th birthday. After he let me out, I walked all around the area and talked to a few guys. I stopped to pet a dog. I was happy. It felt amazing not to be in any hurry and to wait for as long as I wanted before shooting up. After all, I didn't even need the stuff anymore, did one? After a while, though, a guy walked past me and asked if I wanted some dope, and I said yes. He walked ahead to Ernst Reuter Place, where I bought a quarter off of him for 40 marks. After that, I went straight into the ladies' bathroom nearby, which happened to be fairly clean. I only put half of the dope on the spoon because after a withdrawal you're not supposed to start with a full dose right off the bat. I made a little ceremony out of giving myself the shot since I thought that it was going to be the absolute last time ever. 2 hours later, I woke up. My butt had slipped way down into the toilet, and the needle was still stuck in my arm. My things were strewn all over the place in the tiny toilet stall where I had passed out. But it only took a few seconds for me to regain my composure. My decision to quit hadn't come a second soon. My whole plan about taking a nice little walk through the old neighborhood was off the table now. All the optimism that I'd started out with had evaporated. In the cafeteria nearby, I had some mashed potatoes with leeks for a little under 3 marks, but I couldn't keep it down. I dragged myself to Zoo Station to say goodbye to Ditloff, but he wasn't there. I had to get home. My kitty needed me. Kitty was still right where I'd left him, on my pillow. I cleaned out my syringe and then dribbled some more chamomile tea and sugar into his mouth. This wasn't exactly the way I'd imagined I'd be spending my last few hours as a junkie. I thought that maybe I should postpone my checking at the clinic so that I could still do that last walk down the Ku Dam. But then my mom came in and asked where I'd been all afternoon. I told her, and she asked, "Didn't you want to stop by Narcotics Abusers Anonymous today, to find out about a few things?" I immediately went ballistic and started yelling at her. "Leave me alone!" I screamed. I didn't have any time. "Don't you understand? You're going over there tonight," she yelled back at me. "Go pack your things right now. And you're staying there overnight." I had just cooked myself a pork chop with mashed potatoes. I took the plate, went to the bathroom, locked myself in, and sat on the toilet. So this was my last night at my mom's. I was yelling at her because she'd figured out that I was back on H again and because I hated myself for having shot up one more time. And I was ready to check myself into Narconon. One packed a few things into my duffel bag and then slid the syringe, a spoon, and the rest of the dope into my underpants. We took a taxi to Zehlendorf, where the Narconon house was. The Narconon people didn't ask me any questions at first. So they really did seem to admit anyone. They even had recruiters who went out to the drug-saturated areas of the city and talked to the junkies there, trying to convince them to join the Narconon rehab program. But they did question my mom. They wanted to be paid up front, 1,500 marks as a down payment for the first month. No way my mom had that much money. But she promised to drop it off the next morning. She needed to take out a loan. She begged and pleaded with them to let me stay, and they finally agreed. I asked if I could use the bathroom, and they let me. So it wasn't like at the other rehab centers I'd heard about, where if they found something on you, you had to go home. When I came out again, they could see that I was high, but they didn't say anything. I gave them my syringe and spoon. The guy who collected it from me looked surprised. "We really appreciate your giving this up voluntarily." I had to go to the cold turkey room since now they knew I was doped up. There were 2 others in that room, but one of them hightailed it out of there the next morning. That worked out well for the Narconon people because when someone left right away, they still got to keep the full payment for the month. They gave me some books about the teachings of the Church of Scientology. Some of the stuff I read was pretty incredible. It all sounded okay to me. At least they had some good stories, stories that you could choose to either believe or not believe. So I looked through their books for something that sounded believable. After 2 days, they let me leave the cold turkey room since I didn't have bad withdrawal symptoms after only 2 shots. I was put into a room with someone named Krista. She was certifiable. From the word go, she was resistant to all of their attempts to help her, laughing at the therapists and mocking the therapy in general. She walked into our room and searched the baseboard trim for pills. She was convinced that someone, sometime, must have hidden some acid or pills in there. She took me up to the attic at one point and started talking about how we should bring some mattresses up there, along with some weed and wine, and have an orgy. This woman really depressed me. Even though I knew she was nuts, she made it hard for me to get my mind off drugs, and she was always talking about how the Narcanon people had shit for brains. Meanwhile, I was still trying to take it seriously and get clean. On day 2, my mom called to say that my cat had died. That was my 15th birthday. She wished me a happy birthday only after she had given me the news about my cat. She was upset about it, too. After that I spent the rest of my birthday morning sitting on my bed and crying. Ivan the Narcanon guy saw that I was crying and couldn't make myself stop. They said that I needed a session. I was locked in a room with a guy who used to be a junkie, and he started right out by giving me a bunch of seemingly useless instructions. I was only allowed to say yes and was supposed to obey every command. The guy said, "See the wall. Go to the wall. Touch the wall." And then he'd point to a different wall and start all over again. For what seemed like forever, I was forced to run wall to wall in this stupid room. At some point, I'd had enough and said, "Come on, what is this crap? Are you guys nuts? Leave me alone. I can't handle this anymore." But he just stared at me with this dumb smile plastered across his face. That smile of his never changed, never wavered, and after a while he wore me down, and I agreed to keep going. After the wall, he would point to something else, and we would keep going. But finally I couldn't move another step, and I threw myself onto the floor, screaming and crying. He smiled and I kept going after I'd calmed down. By now I was also smiling that same smile. I was completely unemotional, like a robot. I'd touched the wall even before he'd issued his command. The only thing I kept thinking was that, at some point, it had to end. After exactly 5 hours he said, "Okay, that's enough for today." I actually felt kind of awesome. I had to follow him into another room. Inside there was a funny-looking, homemade instrument, a kind of pendulum between two tin cans. He told me to touch the pendulum. "Are you feeling well?" he asked. "I feel good," I told him. "It seems like I'm way more aware of everything I'm experiencing, way more conscious." The guy stared at the pendulum and then said, "It didn't move, so you weren't lying. The session seems like it was a success. I guess that funny little thing was a lie detector." In any case, I was happy that the pendulum hadn't moved. For me it was proof that I was really doing well. I was ready to believe anything in order to get off of H. They were doing all sons of weird things there. Even Krista came down with a fever that same evening. They made her touch a bottle over and over again, and every time she did they would ask her if it was hot or cold. In her feverish state of mind, she didn't seem to care though. After an hour of that routine, they declared that her fever was gone. I was so excited by all this that first thing the next morning, I ran into their office and asked for another therapy session. For that whole first week, I was 100% committed to the program and really bought into the Scientologists' outlook on things. The therapy program ran all day. Conversation, chores, kitchen duties, etc. All day, every day, until 10 p.m. It didn't leave you any time to think. The only thing that bugged me was the food. I wasn't spoiled or a picky eater, not by any means, but I could hardly swallow the glop they offered up. Plus, I thought that with all the money they were pulling in, they could give us something a lot better. They had almost no other expenses. The sessions were led by former junkies. They were all supposed to have been clean for at least a couple of months, but even these employees weren't really paid anything. They were told that it was part of their treatment to lead these sessions, and all they got for compensation was some occasional pocket money. I also didn't like it that the Narconon bosses always ate apart from the rest of us. Once, I happened to walk in on them during lunch, and they were feasting on amazing-looking fknot. On Sunday, I finally had some time to just sit and reflect. First I thought about Dittelf, which made me pretty sad. Then I took a minute to think long and hard about my options after I was finished with this therapy program. I asked myself if the sessions had actually helped me. I had all these questions but no real answers. I wanted to talk to somebody, but who could I go to? One of the first rules of the house was that making friends was not allowed. And the Narconon people immediately slapped you with another session if they heard that you wanted to talk about your problems. I suddenly realized that I'd never really talked to anyone the whole time I'd been at this place. Monday morning I walked into the office and let loose. I didn't let anyone interrupt me. I started with the food. Then I said that almost all my underwear had been stolen. You could never get into the laundry room because the girl who had the key kept disappearing, probably to go shoot up herself. Speaking of which, there were a few patients who ran off to score heroin and shoot up and came back whenever they wanted to. I told them that all this stuff threw me off and made me feel defeated. And then there were the chores. I was totally exhausted because I never had enough time to sleep and rest up. I said, "Okay, your sessions are pretty effective, I really like them. But the thing is, they're not solving my actual problems. Because everything is just one big drill. You're just drilling us into submission. But I also need someone whom I can sometimes talk to about my problems. And anyway, I need some time alone, too, every once in a while, where I can just relax and think." They heard me out, smiling the whole time, as always, but they didn't even try to offer a response. When I was finished, they just prescribed an extra all-day session for me. After that, I was completely defeated, totally apathetic. And I thought, well, maybe they do know what they are doing. When she visited, my mom told me that social services was reimbursing her for the cost of the Narconon program. So I reasoned that if the government was willing to pay for this, then it must be an okay program. There were other people in the house who had it way worse than I did. Gabby, for example. She had a crush on some guy in the building and was desperate to sleep with him. Being the naive moron that she was, she told the Narconon bosses about it right away and was promptly prescribed an extra session. And when she did have sex with the guy, it came out, and the two of them were exposed and ridiculed in front of everybody. Gabby ran out on the program that same night, and we never saw her again. The guy, who apparently had been clean for a few years and who worked there as an assistant, bailed on the operation a little later on. It sounded like he'd reverted back to his old ways. The Narconon people weren't actually that concerned about the sex, it was really just relationships that they were afraid of. But that guy'd been there for over a year, and how are you supposed to last that long without any friendships? During the short amount of free time we had late at night, I hung out with the younger crowd. I was the youngest person in the entire house. But in our little friend group that came together, nobody was 17 yet. It was around about this time that the first wave of addicts came in who had first starting using when they were literally kids. After 1 or 2 years, they'd become just as devastated as I was. The younger you were, the more the poison seemed to affect you. Like me, there was no way they would be accepted by any of the other programs. Almost all of these new admissions struggled with the methods here just as badly as I had. When two of us, the younger ones, were together, the whole session dissolved into chaos. How could you stay serious for long, anyway, when you were supposed to yell at a soccer ball or stare into each other's eyes for hours on end? There wasn't any need to worry about the lie detector anymore because we'd readily admit that the session hadn't done anything for us anyway. I guess that wasn't true because it made us laugh, but that was it. The poor session leaders were totally at a loss when they had to work with us. At the end of the day, there was just one thing we talked about now. I started making plans to leave. After 2 weeks at Narconon, I'd figured out an escape plan, and it worked. 2 boys and I disguised ourselves as the Great House Cleaning Platoon. With a garbage can, a mop, and a bucket, we got through all the doors. The 3 of us were blissfully happy. We almost peed our pants in our giddy anticipation of schnoting up. At the subway station we went our separate ways. I was headed to Zoo Station, to see Dittelf. Dittelf wasn't there but Stella was. She almost fainted when she saw me. She said that nobody had seen Dittelf lately, and I was afraid that he'd landed in jail. Stella said that Zoo Station was in a real depression, so we went to the boulevard at Kurfürstenstrasse instead. Things were dead there, too. We made our way from the subway stop at Kurfürstenstrasse up to Lutzau Place before someone finally pulled over beside us. We recognized the car and the guy inside it. He'd followed us before, and one time he even stuck around when we went to a public bathroom to shoot up. We always thought he was an undercover cop, but apparently he was just a customer who had a thing for young heroin junkies. He only wanted me, but Stella came along for the ride. I said, 35 for a blowjob, and I won't do anything more than that. He said, I'll give you 100 marks. I was blown away. That was totally unprecedented. Even the customers in the biggest, brightest Mercedes had a fit over a mere 5 marks. And this guy, in a dinged-up rusty old Viv, was volunteering to give me 100. After a minute, he said that he was an officer in the Federal Intelligence Service, so in other words, he was probably full of shit. But these kinds of cocky, conman types were also some of my best clients back at Zoo Station because they liked to puff themselves up by throwing money around. He really did give me 100 marks though. Right away Stella found us some dope, and the first thing we did was give ourselves a shot, right there in the car. We drove over to the Pension Amise, a small hotel. Stella waited in the hallway outside. I took my time with this guy because I was super high from my first fix in 2 weeks, but also because he had paid a pretty decent amount. I was so doped up that I didn't want to get up off the narrow cot in that grubby hotel room. I talked with the guy for a little bit afterward. He was a funny kind of show-off. At the end, he said that he had half a gram of heroin, and that he would give it to us if we would come back to the Kurfürstenstrasse in 3 hours. And then, after that, I managed to squeeze even more out of him, another 30 marks. I said we needed the money to get some good food for a change. I told him that I had never been fooled by his VW. I knew it was a cover-up, and that he was rich since he was working in intelligence. So he couldn't very well say no then. He had to hand over the cash. Stella and I went back to Zoo Station because I was still hoping I'd be able to find Dittelf. Suddenly this small, shaggy, spotted dog ran over and jumped up on me. I must have reminded the dog of someone. I thought the dog was unbelievably cute. It looked like a sled dog that had shrunk a few sizes in the wash. A couple seconds later, this ratty, disheveled old guy came after the dog and actually asked me if I wanted to buy it. I did. He wanted 70 marks, but I talked him down to 40. I was high, both on dope and due to the fact that I finally had a dog again. Stella thought I should call it Lady Jane. I decided to go with Janie. We ate pork chops with vegetables and potatoes at a restaurant in the Kurfürstenstrasse, and Janie got the leftovers. The intelligence officer really did come by, right on time, and he gave me a real half of a gram. I couldn't believe it. This half gram was worth 100 marks. Stella and I then went and paid one last visit to Zoo Station in the hopes of finding Ditlev. We ran into Babsy instead, and I was so happy to see her because despite all of our fights, I liked her a lot, even better than Stella. The three of us went into the station cafe and sat down. Babsy looked terrible. Her legs were like matchsticks, and her chest had completely flattened out. She said she weighed 66 pounds. Only her face was as beautiful as always. I told them about Narconon and how cool it had been over there. Stella didn't want to hear anything about it. She said she was born to be a junkie and that's the way it was always going to be. Babsy, however, was totally into the idea of the two of us going to Narconon together and quitting H for good. Her parents and grandma had also unsuccessfully tried to find a place in a rehab program for her. Babsy was couch surfing again, but she really wanted to quit. She was in a horrible state. Once we'd all caught up, I knocked Janie into Metro, an expensive but still pretty underwhelming store in the station that stayed open at night for a while. I bought 2 bags of dog food and a whole bunch of instant pudding for myself. Then I called Narconon to ask if I could come back. They said yes. I said that I'd be bringing along a girlfriend but didn't let on that the friend was Janie. Although I'd never actually spent time thinking about it, I'd basically always known that I'd be heading back to Narconon. Where else could I have gone? My mom would have freaked out if I showed up on her doorstep. Also, my sister had moved out of my dad's place and was now living at my mom's, taking up my old and my bed. Couch surfing wasn't for me. And the last thing I wanted to do was be completely dependent on a John who took me in for the night. I'd never stayed overnight with a customer because that automatically meant we'd have to have sex. But most importantly, I still wanted to get clean for good. And I still believed that I could do it at Narconon because for me there were no other choices left. In the house, we always called it just the house. They were cold, but they didn't say anything. Not about my escape, and not about Janie. There were already about 20 cats in the house, so how much of a difference would a dog make? I brought some old blankets down from the attic and made up a dog bed for Janie, right next to me. The next morning, the dog had covered the entire room in shit and piss. Janie had never been house trained. She was a total nutcase. But then again, so was I. I loved Janie, so I didn't mind having to clean up after her again and again. I was immediately given an extra session. It didn't bother me. I just went through the motions automatically. The only thing that got on my nerves was the fact that, so long as I was in here, I couldn't be with my dog. Other people were taking care of her while I was in sessions, and that made me sick. She was my dog. Everyone played with her, and she played with everyone. She was kind of a slut like that. Everybody fed her, and she just got fatter and fatter. But I only talked to her when we were alone. It was nice to have someone I could talk to. I ran away 2 more times. The last time I was gone for 4 days. That was my first experience with couch surfing. I could stay with Stella because at that time her mom was in a psychiatric clinic with the DTs. 35 All the old shit started up again. Customers, shooting up, customers, shooting up. Then I found out that Ditlev had gone to Paris with Bernd, and I had a fit. The idea that Ditlev, who was basically like my husband, would just up and leave Berlin without even letting me know, that was the last straw. We'd always dreamed about going to Paris together. We were going to rent a small room in Montmartre or some neighborhood like that and go cold turkey together because neither of us had ever heard of there being a heroin scene in Paris. We believed that there were no drugs in Paris, only a lot of cool artists who drank a lot of coffee and maybe sometimes had some wine. So now Ditlev was in Paris with Bernd. I'd lost my boyfriend. I was all alone. All the old fights and irritations had risen up again with Babsy and Stella. The only one I had left was Janie. I called into Narconon at one point while I was away, and they told me that my mom had already picked up my stuff. So my mom had given up on me, too. Somehow that made me furious. Now I wanted to show them all. I wanted to show them that I could do it all on my own. I went to Narconon and they knocked me in again. I participated in their therapies like I was possessed. I did everything I was told to do. I became a real model student and was allowed to use the lie detector apparatus, and its pendulum never moved when I said that a session had been good for me. I thought, now you'll make it. I didn't call my mom because, what did she care? She'd already checked me out. I just borrowed the stuff I needed, like boys' underpants. I didn't care one bit. I just didn't want to ask my mom to bring back my stuff. One day my dad called. "Hi, Christiane," he said. "So tell me, where the hell's this place you're living now?" I just happened to find out about it. I just said, "It's great that sometimes you remember that you actually have a daughter. Awesome job, Dad." So, do you really want to stay at that place, with all those wackos? Me, definitely, for sure. I could hear my dad taking a long, deep breath before he asked if I would like to come out to eat with him and a friend. "Yeah," I said. "Sure. I can do that." Half an hour later, I had to go down to the office to meet him. There he was, my dad, live and in the flesh. He came up to see my room, where I was housed with 4 other patients. "Look at this frigging mess," he mumbled. After all, he'd been a neat freak all his life. And it really did look like a bomb had gone off in there. Every room was like that, a total mess, with clothes everywhere. Because we were heading outside, one of the bosses said to my dad, "You're required to sign a statement that you'll be bringing Christiane back." My dad went ballistic. He shouted that he was my father, and that he alone could determine where his daughter was allowed to go, and when. He was going to take me with him, and they wouldn't need to wait up. I started moving backward, toward the therapy room, and said, "I want to stay. I don't want to die, Daddy. Please let me stay." The Narconon people, who'd been attracted by the yelling, all came running and backed me up. My dad ran outside and shouted, "I'm coming back with the police." I knew that he wasn't bluffing. I ran up to the attic and climbed onto the roof. There was a kind of platform for the chimney sweep. I crouched down on that and shivered with cold. Then 2 patrol cars arrived. The cops searched the house with my dad from top to bottom. Meanwhile, the Narconon bosses started getting scared and also started calling for me. But nobody found me on the roof. Eventually the cops drove off, and my dad left with them. The next morning I called my mom at work. I started crying right away. "What's going on?" I asked her. "Nothing's happening." My mom responded with a voice that was as cold as ice, "I couldn't care less about what happens to you." I said, "I don't want Dad to take me away from here. You are the custodial parent. You can't just give up on me and leave me to fend for myself. I'm staying here and I never leave again, I swear. Please, do something so that Dad can't just take me out of here. I really truly need to stay here. Otherwise I'll die, Mom. Seriously, you have to believe me." When she spoke she sounded impatient. "No, I can't. I won't." Then she hung up. At first I felt like I was now a completely lost cause. But then my rage returned. They can all kiss my ass, I thought. Your whole life they didn't care one iota about what was happening to you. And now they feel like they can do whatever they want with you, when they've never done anything right. Those assholes totally let you get sucked down the drain. Kessie's mom made sure that Kessie didn't end up totally fucked up. And now that you're really struggling, they are trying to tell you what to do. They are fucking crazy. I asked for an extra session and totally immersed myself in it. I wanted to stay at Narcotics Abusers Anonymous and maybe even become a member of the Church of Scientology. In any case, I wouldn't let anyone take me away from here. I didn't want my parents to damage me any further. That's what I was thinking to myself while my anger burned itself out anyway. 3 days later my dad came back, and I was forced to come down to the office. He was really calm. He said that I had to go with him to the social services department since they were reimbursing my mom for her payments to Narcanon. I said, "No, I'm not coming along. I know you, Dad. If I come with you, I'll never see this house again. And I don't want to die." My dad showed an authorization document to the Narcanon managers, that stated that he was permitted to take me out of here. My mom had given him the authority. The head of Narcanon said that there was nothing he could do, and that I had to go with my dad. They couldn't keep me here against his will. When we said goodbye, the head of Narcanon said that I shouldn't forget to do my exercises. Always confront. Confronting was one of their magic words. We were supposed to confront everything. What a bunch of idiots, I thought. There's nothing for me to confront. I'll have to die. I just can't take it anymore. After 2 weeks I'll get doped up again. I can't do it. I'll never make it on my own. This was one of the rare moments when I saw my situation as clear as day. In my despair I really believed that Narcotics Abusers Anonymous was my only lifeline. I was sobbing with rage and despair, on and on and on, it seemed I would never stop. I cried so hard that I could barely breathe. Christiane's mom, after that fiasco at Narcanon, I didn't think it was a very good idea for my ex-husband to take Christiane in and help bring her to her senses, as he put it. Aside from the fact that he couldn't supervise her around the clock, thinking about Christiane in the care of her dad caused me emotional indigestion. Mainly because of the memories of my relationship with him, but also because her sister had just moved back in with me as a result of his overbearing tactics. But I didn't know what else to do and hoped that maybe he'd succeed where I had failed. But I also don't want to exclude the possibility that I was eager to find any reason, however implausible, that would give me a break from Christiane and her issues. Since her first withdrawal, I'd been swinging back and forth between hope and despair. When I asked her dad to intervene, I was physically and emotionally drained. I was at the end of my rope. Just 3 weeks after her first withdrawal, which Christiane bravely endured, along with Ditlev, back at my place, the police called me at work and informed me that they'd picked up Christiane at Zoo Station. I was asked to come and get her. That first relapse hit me like a ton of bricks. I sat at my desk, shaking. Every 2 minutes I glanced at the clock to see if it was 4 p.m. yet. I didn't dare leave before the end of the workday. I didn't want to entrust my family's pain and trouble to anyone else. My boss's 2 daughters would have basically condemned me. I suddenly gained some understanding of what Ditlev's dad had tried to express. You really are very ashamed, especially at first. Christiane's eyes were almost swollen shut when I got to the police station. That's how hard she must have cried. The police officer showed me the fresh needle track on her arm and told me she had been arrested at Zoo Station in an unambiguous position. At first I couldn't imagine what unambiguous position meant, but maybe I really didn't want to know anyway. Christiane was intensely unhappy about her relapse. I helped her withdraw again. Without Ditlev. She stayed at home and seemed determined to make it work. I got up my courage and let her school advisor know about what was going on. He was shocked, but he thanked me for my openness. He wasn't used to that from other parents. He suspected that there were more heroin addicts at the school, and he would have liked to help Christiane. The only problem was that he didn't know how. It was always the same. It didn't matter who I talked to, either people were as helpless as I was, or they had already completely given up on people like Christiane. I saw this same thing over and over again. Slowly I began to realize how easily teenagers came into contact with heroin. The dealers were already waiting for them on their way to school. I couldn't believe my ears when Christiane was once approached by one of these guys, in my presence, while we were out shopping. She told me how she knew these people, that guy deals with this guy, and this guy sells that, and that one over there does this or that. It all seemed so crazy. What's going on here, anyway? What kind of a place to live is this? I wanted to transfer Christiane to a different school, so that she could at least avoid that particular route to school and its inherent dangers. It was right before spring break, so right before I wanted her to start at the new school. I hoped that this was a way I could pull her out of the environment she was used to and away from the dangers at the subway stations. Of course, that was a naive idea and my plan didn't even come to fruition anyway. The principal of the other school told us right off the bat that they didn't like to take students from a comprehensive school like Christiane's. And Christiane's grades were far too poor for him to make an exception. Out of curiosity, he asked why Christiane wanted to switch schools. When Christiane said that there was no sense of community or camaraderie there, the principal smirked. Camaraderie? Of course there's no camaraderie at a school like yours. He said that since the students were always being shuffled and resorted in their classes, there was just no chance for any kind of community spirit to develop. I don't know who was more disappointed, Christiane or I. She just said, "This is so pointless. Rehab is the only thing that can help me." But how would I ever get her a spot in a rehab program? I called each and every regional office and state office, every department, every authority. The best thing they could come up with were the drug counseling centers. And the drug counseling centers insisted that Christiane approach them voluntarily. As much as they all fought with each other and berated the other centers for their methods, they all agreed on that one point: voluntary participation was the only way to start. Otherwise, a recovery would be impossible. When I begged Christiane to go to a counseling center, she became obstinate and combative. "What good would that do?" she said. "And anyway, they don't have any openings for me. No way I'm going to hang around their place for weeks on end, doing absolutely nothing." What was I supposed to do? If I dragged her against her will, I would have been betraying their primary requirement. That being said, today I can at least understand their position. At the time, Christiane probably wasn't emotionally mature enough to undergo a serious therapy program. On the other hand, it still seems wrong to deny assistance to addicts who are still so young. We should do whatever we can to help them. Later, at the various points when Christiane felt run down, depressed, and helpless, when she felt so bad that she would have happily checked herself into a strict rehab program, it was always the same: there were no spots open, and she'd have to spend 6 to 8 weeks on a waiting list. It left me speechless. The only thing I could respond with was, "What if she's dead by then?" Well, in the meantime, she should come to us for some advisory interviews, so that we can figure out if she's serious about quitting. Looking back, I have a hard time finding fault with the drug counselors. With the few spots that they had available for addicts in rehab programs, they invariably had to make some tough choices. So I never managed to get her a place in a rehab program. But when Christiane returned from spring vacation, I had the impression that she didn't need one anymore. She looked really refreshed and healthy. I thought that she had finally quit for good. She also made a lot of disparaging remarks about her friend Babsy. She said that Babsy was selling herself to old men for heroin. Christiane insisted that she would never be able to do something like that. She talked a lot about how glad she was to be away from all that crap. She seemed dedicated to staying sober. I could have sworn that she really meant it. However, after just a few days she slid right back into the same old behavior. I could tell by her tiny pupils. I didn't want to hear her lame excuses anymore. When I confronted her, she would say things like, "What? I just smoked a little weed, that's all. Relax." This was the start of a very bad time. She told me bald-faced lies and stuck with them even when I knew she was lying and told her so. I grounded her, but she didn't care. She left the house anyway. I considered locking her up inside, but then she would have jumped out of the window. We were in a second-floor apartment, and I didn't want to risk her injuring herself. I was at the end of my rope, my nerves were completely frayed. I couldn't stand looking into her distant eyes anymore. 3 months had gone by since I'd caught her in the bathroom. Every couple of days the newspapers reported on yet another heroin-related death. Most of the time they only dedicated a couple of lines to each incident. They reported on heroin overdoses as routinely and dispassionately as they covered traffic accidents. I was a wreck, just so insanely worried all the time. Especially now that Christiane had stopped opening up. She wouldn't admit to anything, and the constant lies and deception were really unnerving to me. When she felt like I'd figured her out, or if I caught her in a lie, she'd become obscene and aggressive. Slowly but surely, her personality began to change. I worried about her survival. I stopped automatically providing her with her allowance of 20 marks. There was this constant fear living inside me: if I give her an allowance, then she'll buy herself a shot, and that could be the one that kills her. I could almost live with the fact that she was addicted. But it was the fear that the next shot could be her last that destroyed me. I was at least a little reassured by the fact that she was at home now, otherwise I'd be like Babs's mom, who had to call me all the time, in tears, asking if I knew where her daughter was. I was constantly on edge. When the phone rang, I feared that it was the police or the morgue or some other horrible place. To this day, I still sit bolt upright in bed when the phone rings at night. There was absolutely no reasoning with Christiane anymore. When I'd address her addiction, she would just scream, "Leave me alone." I got the impression that Christiane had given up on herself. Even though she kept insisting that she was only doing pot now, and not heroin, I was able to see through those kinds of lines. I'd stopped deceiving myself. I searched her room regularly and would often come across her drug paraphernalia. 2 or 3 times I even found a syringe. I'd throw them at her feet, which only made her yell at me, totally offended. She said they were Hitler's, and that she'd taken them away from him. One day when I came home from work, they were both sitting on her bed and had just heated up a spoon. I was dumbfounded by their audacity. All I could do was scream at them. "Get out!" I yelled. "Just leave. Now." After they'd left, I broke down and cried. I felt an incredible rage toward the police and toward the government. I felt completely abandoned. One of the Berlin papers reported another death from heroin overdose. There had already been more than 30 victims in that year alone. And it was only May. I couldn't grasp any of it. You could see on TV what huge sums the government was spending on the fight against terrorism. But in Berlin the dealers were running around unencumbered, selling heroin like ice cream cones openly in the streets. I was really getting myself worked up. Who knows what else was running through my mind at that moment. I sat there in my living room, looking at my furniture, piece by piece. I think I was in the right frame of mind to smash it all to bits. This furniture was all I had. This was the reward for all my hard work. I started to cry again. That night, when Christiane returned, I had decided to give her some measure of real punishment. While I was waiting for her to come home, sitting alone on my bed, my thoughts ran wild with a mixture of fear, guilt, and regret. I felt like I'd failed, not only because my marriage had broken down, and because I had so little time for my kids, but also because I'd been too ashamed, too cowardly, to face up to the reality of Christiane's situation. That evening I lost my last illusion. Christiane didn't come home until after midnight. From my window I could see her get out of a Mercedes. She was dropped off right at the front door. My God, I thought, that's it. That's the end. She's given up all self-respect. The catastrophe was complete. I was shattered. I grabbed her and spanked her so hard and long that my hands hurt. In the end, we both sat on the carpet and cried. Christiane was in pieces. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her that I knew she was prostituting herself. She shook her head and sobbed, but not in the way you think, Mom. I didn't want to hear about the details. I sent her off to take a bath and then get in bed. Nobody can imagine how I felt. The thought of her selling her body was killing me. It was even worse than the news about her heroin addiction. I didn't get any sleep that night. What other options did we have? What could we still do? In my desperate state of mind, I even thought of putting her in an institution, but that would have only made things worse. Initially, they would have placed Christiane in the central home on Ollenhauer Street. And I'd already heard some negative things about that place. Apparently the girls there have a tendency to recruit each other into prostitution. There was only one thing to do, I had to send Christiane away from Berlin immediately. Forever. Whether she wanted to go or not. She had to get away from this place, from this morass that sucked her down over and over again. She needed to go someplace far away from all this heroin. My own mother, who lived in the state of Hesse, was willing to take Christiane in, as was my sister-in-law in Schleswig-Holstein. But when I told Christiane about my decision, she was dejected, almost distraught. Still, I'd already begun making plans and preparations, and I would have followed through with them, but eventually Christiane came to me, meek and full of regret, and declared she was ready to begin with a rehab program. She'd already found a place that had an opening. A place called Narcotics Abusers Anonymous. That was a weight off my shoulders. I wasn't sure if she could make it without any professional assistance, and I was also afraid that she might run away from my relatives. I didn't know much about this Narcotics Abusers Anonymous program, but I had heard that it involved a substantial fee for services rendered. So 2 days before Christiane's 15th birthday, I called for a taxi and went with her to Narconon. A young man did the intake interview with us. He congratulated us on our decision and reassured me that from now on I didn't have to worry anymore. He said that the therapy at Narconon was usually successful. He seemed really confident, and, to be honest, I couldn't remember the last time I felt so relieved. Then he put the contract in front of me and went over all the details of the program, including my own financial responsibility. It cost 52 marks a day, and the payment had to be made 4 weeks in advance. That was more than I made at work in that same amount of time. But what did that matter when you considered what was at stake? Besides, the representative indicated that I could probably get the costs for the program reimbursed by social services. The next day I scraped together 500 marks and brought them to the Narconon offices. Then I took out a loan for 1,000 marks and made the payment at the next parents' evening. A group of reformed addicts ran these evenings. You couldn't tell that the one I saw used to be a junkie, at least I couldn't. He looked pretty normal. That was thanks to Narconon, he said. After getting clean, he'd become a new person. That certainly impressed all the parents. And he assured me, in particular, that Christiane was making good progress. It turned out that they were just putting on an act. Like everyone else, they just wanted our money. Later I found out, in a newspaper article, that Narconon belonged to a dubious American religious organization, and that it was profiting from parents' fears about their children. But as usual, I didn't realize what was going on before much too late. Initially, I thought that Christiane was in the best of hands. I wanted to leave her there for as long as possible. But in order to do that, I needed money. I ran from one government office to the next, from one department to the next. But nobody wanted to take any responsibility for Christiane. And at the same time, nobody told me what was really going on at Narconon. I felt discouraged. I felt conned. Everyone acted like I was just wasting their time. Then finally, somebody told me that I first needed to get a statement from a government-approved doctor certifying that Christiane was indeed a drug addict before I could even begin to apply for reimbursement of her therapy fees. I thought that was a joke. Anyone who knew even a little bit about this topic could plainly recognize the misery in Christiane's face. But those were the rules. The thing was, when I finally managed to get an appointment with the officially approved doctor, an appointment that took 2 weeks for me to get, Christiane had run away from Narconon again. It was already the 3rd time. I broke down and cried. I thought, now it'll start all over again. We're back at square one. Every time that she returned, I was convinced that this was the time that she would finally make it, and every time, I was disappointed. My boyfriend and I went out to look for her. In the afternoons we'd check out the park that young people often hung out at called Hasten Hyde 36, at night we'd go downtown and to the clubs, and in between we'd go scouring the subway stations. We went wherever the drugs were. With each new day, we'd renew the hunt. We even checked the public bathrooms all over the city, just in case. We'd reported her as missing, but they only said that they'd add Christiane to their missing persons list. She'd show up again, they said. All I wanted to do was crawl into a hole and disappear. I was consumed by fear. Fear of that phone call, "Your daughter is dead." I was just a bundle of nerves. I wasn't interested in anything anymore, and I didn't want to do anything. I had to force myself to go to work. I started getting heart palpitations, and I could hardly move my left arm. At night it would tingle and go numb. My stomach was constantly upset. My kidneys hurt and my head felt like it was going to explode. I was physically and mentally spent. I went to my doctor, who told me it was all nerves and prescribed me some Valium. When I told him why I was such a mess, he said that a couple of days ago another such young girl had come to him, confessed her drug addiction, and asked him for advice on what she should do. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her to go and hang herself." That was his answer. Just like that. It was hopeless. When Christiane showed up again at Narconon a week later, I couldn't even bring myself to feel relief. It was like a part of me had died. I was of the opinion that I had done everything humanly possible, but nothing had helped. Whatever I did, things always got worse. It was like a snowball tumbling downhill. Narconon had done more harm than good. Christiane had changed during her time there. She made a bad impression now. She was vulgar, almost to the point of repulsiveness, and had lost whatever girlish innocence she still had left. I was suspicious even during my first visit to Narconon. Christiane had become a stranger to me already. Something had been destroyed. Up until then, despite everything, she'd still had a connection to me, but now that was gone. It was like she'd been brainwashed. It was at this point that I asked my ex-husband to take Christiane out of Berlin, to Western Germany. But he preferred to take her in himself. He'd be able to deal with her, he said. And if she didn't cooperate, then maybe a little corporal punishment would help. I didn't object. I'd reached the end of my rope. I'd already made so many mistakes and miscalculations that suddenly I was afraid to take any further actions of my own. Before we went home to my dad's, he dragged me with him to his favorite bar, the Hungry Woodpecker, at the Vitskyly subway station. He wanted to order me a drink 37, but I just wanted some juice. He said I had to put a stop to taking drugs if I didn't want to die, and I said, well, yeah, that's exactly why I wanted to stay at Narconon. The jukebox kept playing the same song over and over again. A few teens were playing pinball and pool. My dad said that they were all just good, normal teens. If I hung out here more often, I'd make some new friends and realize how crazy and stupid it was to mess around with junkies and other dope fiends all the time. I was barely listening. I was angry and exhausted and just wanted to be left alone. I hated everyone, and just when I felt like I might have found a kind of escape, a route to a better life, my dad had slammed the door right in my face. I took Janie into bed with me that night and asked her, Janie, do you understand us humans? I answered for her, no, of course you don't. You run up to everyone, wagging your tail. You think people are good. I didn't like that about her. I would have preferred it if she would have growled at people first. She shouldn't be so trusting. When I woke up, I saw that Janie hadn't yet peed on the floor, so I was eager to take her out right away. My dad had already left for work. Viv and I went to open the front door, it was locked. I yanked at the door handle, I threw myself against the door. It stayed shut. I forced myself to stay calm and not to freak out. How could my own dad lock me up like a wild animal? Especially when he knew I had a dog. I tore through the apartment, looking for a key. I thought he must have put a key somewhere. What if there was a fire? I looked under the bed, on the windowsills, even in the fridge. No key. I didn't have time to really freak out because I had to do something with Janie before she ruined the carpet. I took her out on the balcony, and she understood not what to do. Then I went to take a tour of my little prison. A lot had changed since I'd last been here. The bedroom was empty since my mom had taken the beds with her. There was a new couch in the living room, where my dad now slept, and a brand new color TV. The rubber plant was gone and so was the bamboo rod that my dad used to beat me with and store in that pot. Now there was a jade tree plant instead. The old wardrobe was still in the kids' room, and you could still only open one of its doors, otherwise the whole thing would collapse. The bed made creaking and cracking noises whenever you moved. It's pretty sad when your own dad can't even provide you with a decently furnished holding cell. I went back out to the balcony with Janie. She put her front paws on the railing and looked down from our 11th floor apartment. All we could see were the desolate high-rises and barren landscapes of Gropiusstadt. I had to talk to someone, so I called up Narconon. They had a surprise for me. Babsy had shown up. So I guess she'd actually been serious about quitting. She told me that they'd given her my bed. I was so sad that I wasn't there with her. We talked for a long time. Viv and my dad came back. I gave him the silent treatment, but that just had the effect of making him talk even more. He'd planned my whole future out for me. Gave me an actual schedule for every day, including housework, grocery shopping, and feeding his homing pigeons and cleaning up their roost. He had a shelter for his pigeons out in Rudau, too. Every time he went out, he wanted to be able to check up on me by phone. To fill up all my free time, he'd found an old friend of mine, Katharina, who was willing to come and hang out with me. She was a real teen bopper, still in love with top 40 radio and other crap like that. A reward was in it for me, too. He wanted to take me to Thailand with him sometime. He flew to Thailand at least once a year now. He loved it there because of the girls, but also because he was able to get some really cheap clothes. He saved up all of his money for these trips of his. In a way, that was his drug of choice. So I listened to my dad's plans and thought I'd just play along for a while. I didn't really have a choice, anyway. At least that way I wouldn't be locked up. The next day I had a packed schedule. First I had to clean the apartment and then go shopping. Then Katharina came over to take me for a walk. We went all over the place, and then when I told her that I still had to go to Rudao to feed the pigeons, she lost interest and gave up. So I had the rest of the afternoon to myself. I was miserable, and one way or another I just wanted to get high. I didn't really know what to do though. I thought that maybe I could go to the Hazen Hyde for an hour. That's a public park in Newcombe and a good place to go if you want to smoke some weed. A joint sounded pretty good right then. I didn't have any cash, but I knew where I could find some. My dad collected silver coins in an oversized brandy bottle. There were more than 100 marks in that bottle, stored up for his next trip to Thailand. I shook 50 marks out of the bottle. I wanted to have a little extra with me, just in case. Whatever was left over I could put back, and then I thought I could probably replace what I'd spent with money I saved while shopping. That was my plan anyway. In Hazen Hyde Park, I ran into Pyatt. He was the kid from Center House who was with me when I'd smoked pot for the first time in my life. He'd become a heroin addict, so I asked him if they had anything besides weed at this park of his. He asked, "Do you have cash?" I told him I did. "Come with me then." He took me to a couple of dealers, and I bought a quarter. I had 10 marks left now. We went to the public bathrooms at the entrance to the park, and Pyatt let me borrow his syringe. He'd become a really slick old junkie in the time since I'd last seen him, and I had to give him half of my dope to use his syringe. We both gave ourselves a little fix. I felt amazing. The atmosphere at Hazen Hyde Park was way better, way less fucked up than at places like Kurfürstendamm or Zoo Station. The fact that it was mainly just a place to smoke some weed made all the difference in the world. But there were still some junkies, if you poked around a little bit. It didn't cause problems, though, as the junkies and the potheads were generally able to chill out together, side by side. At the Ku-Dam, pot was disdained, it was for lightweights and potheads were generally snubbed. The two groups never mixed at Kurfürstendamm. At Hazen Hyde, it didn't matter what drug you were on. You could even be sober. It wasn't an issue. You just needed to be cool. That was it. Whether you were high or not, if you were cool, then everyone else was cool with you. It was like everyone was part of a big, peaceful community, making music, banging on drums, and just hanging out. The whole atmosphere reminded me of Woodstock. I was home again before my dad got back from work around 6. He didn't notice that I was high. I was feeling a little guilty because I hadn't been able to feed the pigeons. I decided to give them a double portion the next day. I thought that the next time I went to the park I wouldn't shoot up because even if I just smoked a little pot I would feel alright, and I would still be accepted, too. I never wanted to return to the nasty heroin scene at Kurfürstendamm. I truly believed I could manage to get off of H at Hazen Hyde. I started going to the park with Janie every afternoon, even if it was just for a minute. The dog loved it there because there were lots of other dogs running around. And even the dogs were totally friendly. Everyone liked Janie, and she got a lot of attention. I only fed the pigeons every second or third day. That was more than